The chamber existed in a place where time had learned to hold its breath. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into darkness so complete it seemed to devour light itself, while columns of ancient stone rose like the ribs of some long-dead leviathan. Deep red candles burned in iron sconces along walls that had witnessed centuries of bloodshed, their flames casting shadows that writhed and danced with an almost sentient awareness. Through the narrow Gothic windows, moonlight filtered in pale and hesitant, as though afraid to intrude upon the domain of something far older and far more terrible than the night itself. This was the throne room of Elisandra Nocturne, the Crimson Sovereign, the undying queen of the northern wastes. For 300 years she had ruled from this fortress of black stone and bitter memory, her name spoken only in whispers by those foolish enough to speak it at all. Kingdoms had risen and crumbled to dust in the span of her reign. Dynasties had flourished and faded. Wars had raged and ended, their causes forgotten, their heroes reduced to bones and legend. Through it all she had endured, unchanging and eternal, a monument to the terrible permanence of the undead. The castle itself seemed to breathe with her mood. Tonight, that breath came ragged and desperate, like a wounded animal cornered and dangerous. The very stones trembled with a frequency just below human hearing, a vibration that set teeth on edge and sent prey animals fleeing for miles in every direction. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for longer than anyone dared admit. Elisandra stood at the center of her throne room, but she did not sit upon her seat of carved obsidian and human bone. She could not. For 3 days and 3 nights she had been unable to remain still, unable to rest, unable to do anything but pace and rage against the terrible hunger that consumed her from within. It was a hunger that transcended blood, though blood was part of it. A hunger that went deeper than flesh, though flesh called to her with siren intensity. It was the hunger of immortality itself, the price of endless life paid in endless, escalating need. Her appearance betrayed both her ancient nobility and her current torment. The vampire queen stood tall and regal, her posture that of one born to rule, yet every line of her body thrummed with barely contained violence. Her gown was a masterwork of shadow and crimson, black silk that seemed woven from night itself, embroidered with patterns in deep red thread that might have been arterial blood crystallized into fabric. The dress clung to her form before flowing outward in elegant cascades, each movement creating ripples of darkness that whispered secrets in a language older than human speech. Her shoulders were bare, pale as marble and just as cold, marked with a faint tracery of veins that no longer carried mortal blood. But it was her face that truly captured the dichotomy of her nature. Centuries had not touched her beauty, which remained as sharp and perfect as a blade forged by masters long dead. High cheekbones, full lips the color of wine-dark roses, skin like porcelain that had never known the sun's warmth. Her hair fell in midnight cascades past her shoulders, each strand seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Yet despite this terrible beauty, or perhaps because of it, her face now twisted with an expression of such raw, desperate need that it bordered on madness. Her eyes burned. Literally burned, with a crimson luminescence that cast red shadows across her cheekbones and painted the air before her in shades of blood and fire. They were the eyes of a predator pushed beyond all reason, beyond all the careful control that had defined her reign. In those eyes, civilizations could drown. In those eyes, sanity went to die. Her fangs, delicate and deadly as crystal daggers, pressed against her lower lip hard enough to draw her own dark blood. She could feel them aching, yearning, demanding to sink into warm flesh and release the terrible tension that had been building within her for weeks now. The sensation was beyond pain, beyond pleasure. It was a need so fundamental that it superseded thought itself, reducing her, she who had commanded armies and toppled empires, to something base and primal and utterly, terrifyingly uncontrollable. "Where is he?" Her voice echoed through the chamber and the candles flickered in response. It was a voice that had pronounced death sentences and declarations of war, that had seduced nobles and terrified peasants, but now it cracked with desperation. "Where is the offering?" Her council had learned long ago not to approach their queen when she was in such a state. They remained in the shadows at the periphery of the great hall, ancient vampires themselves, lords and ladies who had walked the earth for centuries but who seemed like children in her presence. Even they who had known the ecstasy of the hunt and the sweet surrender to bloodlust, had never seen their sovereign quite like this. Lord Vesper, her chancellor, stepped forward with the caution of one approaching a wounded dragon. He was old even by vampire standards, his face gaunt and aristocratic, his movements precise and controlled. "Your Majesty, the human arrives as we speak." The ritual was completed. The summoning succeeded. Summoning. Elisandra laughed, and the sound was broken glass and dying stars. "You speak as though I had a choice. As though this were strategy rather than surrender." She turned to face him, and he instinctively stepped back, his hand moving to his throat in an unconscious gesture of protection. "Do you know what it is to need, Vesper? Truly need? Not desire, not want, but need with every fiber of your being, every cell screaming in unison." "My queen." 300 years, she interrupted, her voice rising to a near shriek. 300 years of control. Of restraint. Of proving that we are more than monsters, that we can rule with reason rather than rage. And now, she gestured at herself, at the trembling in her hands, at the way her chest heaved with breath she didn't technically need. "Now I am reduced to this. To summoning cattle. To begging the council to bring me a human like some fledgling who cannot control her first thirst." "You are not begging, Your Majesty. You are commanding as is your right. And this is no ordinary human." Something in Vesper's tone cut through the red haze of her hunger. Elisandra focused on him with effort, forcing her mind to engage despite every instinct screaming at her to hunt, to feed, to take. "Explain." The summoning ritual was specific. "You know this. When a vampire of your age and power reaches this state, when the hunger becomes unmanageable, the old magic responds. It does not simply bring prey. It brings possibility." "I don't want possibility," Elisandra snarled. "I want blood. I want warmth. I want to feel something other than this cursed endless cold. And yet the magic provides what we need, not always what we want." Vesper's voice was gentle, the tone of a father speaking to a daughter, though the reality was far more complex. He had been her advisor since she was newly turned, had guided her through the early decades of bloodlust and confusion. If anyone could speak to her in such a state, it was he. The human who comes now was called by your essence itself. The ritual reads the summoner's soul, such as it is, and brings forth one who can answer what truly ails them. "My soul." Alisandra's laugh was bitter. "I sold my soul 3 centuries ago for the promise of eternal life. What remains? More than you think, perhaps. More than any of us suspect." Before she could respond, the great doors of the throne room began to open. They moved slowly, ponderously, those doors of black oak banded with iron, their hinges groaning like the damned. Every eye in the chamber turned toward the widening gap, toward the figure that would emerge from the corridor beyond. The vampire queen froze, every muscle in her body locking into place. Her breathing, unnecessary but habitual, stopped entirely. The burning in her eyes intensified until the very air around her seemed to shimmer with heat haze. Her hands, elegant and deadly, curled into claws at her sides. He stepped into her throne room like a man walking into a cathedral, with respect but without fear, with awareness but without hesitation. He was human, unmistakably so, carrying with him the warmth and vitality that the undead both craved and resented. Yet there was something about his presence that didn't fit the usual pattern of sacrificial offerings. He was neither young nor old, perhaps in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of a life lived outdoors, under sun and stars that vampires could only remember in dreams. His hair was dark brown, touched with auburn highlights that caught the candlelight, worn slightly long and pulled back loosely at the nape of his neck. His face was angular but not harsh, marked with the fine lines that came from squinting at distant horizons and smiling more often than frowning. His eyes, those remarkable eyes, were a deep, warm brown, the color of fertile earth in ancient forests, and they held a calmness that seemed impossible given the circumstances. He wore simple clothes, a white linen shirt unlaced at the The sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with old scars and the lean muscle of practical work. Brown leather breeches and worn boots completed the ensemble. No armor, no weapons, no holy symbols or protective talismans. He carried nothing but himself, and somehow that was enough. The human, his name was Thomas Ashwood, though Elisandra did not yet know this, stood just inside the threshold and gazed around the throne room with the expression of someone cataloging details for later reference. His eyes passed over the shadowed vampires in their alcoves, the guttering candles, the Gothic architecture that spoke of beauty and decay in equal measure. Finally, inevitably, his gaze settled on the vampire queen herself. And something happened. For a moment, just a heartbeat span, Elisandra felt her rage falter. Not because of fear in his eyes, there was none, but because of what she saw instead. Recognition. Not of her personally, but of what she was experiencing. In his calm, steady gaze, she glimpsed understanding, and it shocked her more than a stake through the heart. Then the moment passed, and the hunger roared back with doubled intensity. She moved. Not with the careful, measured grace she usually employed, but with the preternatural speed that made vampires the apex predators they were. One instant she stood in the center of her throne room, the next she was before him, so close that her gown brushed against his legs, so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body like standing before a forge. A sound escaped her throat, something between a moan and a growl, too raw to be called speech. Her hands rose, trembling, to his chest, not quite touching, hovering millimeters from contact as though his warmth might burn her. Her head tilted back to look up at him. He was taller by several inches, and the crimson glow of her eyes painted his face in shades of blood and desire. "You," she breathed, and the word carried centuries of loneliness. "They brought you for me." Thomas Ashwood did not step back. Did not cringe or plead or attempt to flee. He simply stood, solid and present, and when he spoke, his voice was as calm as still water, tinged with an accent that spoke of northern forests and mountain villages far from royal courts. "I volunteered," he said quietly. The statement was so unexpected that it penetrated the red haze more effectively than a shout. Elisandra's eyes widened fractionally. "Volunteered? You know what I am? What will happen to you? I know what you are, your majesty. As for what will happen," a slight smile touched his lips, sad and knowing, "that remains to be seen. You should be afraid." Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it was the whisper of a blade sliding from its sheath. "You should be terrified. I can hear your heart beating, you know. That strong, steady rhythm. I can smell your blood, warm and rich beneath your skin. I can see the pulse in your throat, right there, one clawed finger extended to point but not touch, where the artery runs closest to the surface." "I am afraid," Thomas admitted, and the honesty in his voice was refreshing as rain. "Fear is only sensible. But I'm not terrified, and I won't run." "Why?" The question burst from her, desperate and confused. "Why would anyone volunteer to face me in this state? My own people fear to approach. Do you seek death? Are you one of those religious martyrs hoping for paradise?" "No," he shook his head slowly. "I seek neither death nor paradise. I seek understanding, perhaps. And I thought, in my own small way, I might offer something you need. I need blood." The shout echoed through the chamber, and several of the watching vampires flinched. "I need warmth. I need to remember what it feels like to be something other than this cold, dead thing that walks and talks and pretends at life." Her control shattered completely. Elisandra surged forward, closing the final distance between them, her body pressing against his with desperate intensity. Her arms wrapped around him, pulling him close with strength that could have crushed stone, yet somehow measured enough not to break his fragile human bones. Her face buried against his neck, and she inhaled deeply, drawing in the scent of him, earth and wood smoke, pine resin and honest sweat, and underneath it all, the intoxicating copper sweetness of blood. A shudder ran through her entire body. Her lips parted, fangs fully extended now, the points pressing against the vulnerable flesh of his throat. One bite. One small puncture, and the terrible need that consumed her would be sated. One taste of that warmth, and she could remember for a brief and glorious moment what it felt like to be alive. Thomas stood within her embrace, his arms at his sides, neither fighting nor surrendering. She could feel his heartbeat against her chest, steady and strong, faster than resting but not racing with panic. His warmth enveloped her, and for the first time in weeks, the terrible cold that had settled into her bones began to recede. "Please," she whispered against his skin, and the word contained multitudes. "Please forgive me. Please save me. Please end this torment. Please understand what I've become." "I'm here," Thomas said softly and slowly, carefully, his arms rose to encircle her in return. Not struggling, not pushing away but holding. Offering the most basic and profound of human gestures. Comfort. The vampire queen trembled in his embrace, teetering on the knife's edge between control and chaos, between the ruler she had fought to become and the monster she had always feared she was. Her fangs remained poised against his throat, one small motion away from breaking skin, from releasing the crimson flood she craved beyond reason. The entire court held its breath. The candles ceased their flickering. Even the stones seemed to wait. And in that moment of perfect tension, balanced between destruction and restraint, Thomas Ashwood began very softly to hum. The sound that emerged from Thomas was barely audible at first, little more than a vibration felt rather than heard. It started low in his chest, where Alessandra's cheek pressed against him, and she felt it through the contact before she processed it as music. A gentle thrumming, like the purr of some great cat, like the drone of bees on a summer afternoon, like the fundamental frequency of contentment itself. Then it resolved into melody. The tune was simple, almost painfully so. Not a grand orchestral piece or a complex ballad, but something far more ancient and essential. A lullaby. The kind of song that existed before written music, passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain stretching back to humanity's dawn. 4 notes rising, 3 falling, a pattern that repeated with subtle variations, each iteration like a gentle wave lapping at a shore. Alessandra's first reaction was confusion. Her fangs remained pressed to his throat, her body still coiled with predatory tension, but her mind, that part of her that had ruled kingdoms and commanded armies, struggled to understand what was happening. This was not pleading. Not prayer. Not the frantic babbling of prey confronting its predator. This was something else entirely. The melody continued, patient and unhurried. Thomas didn't seem to expect any immediate reaction, didn't seem to be using the song as a distraction or a weapon. He simply hummed, his arms loose around her trembling form, offering the music the same way he had offered his presence, freely without demand or expectation. The throne room's acoustics, designed to carry the Queen's pronouncements to every corner, caught the simple tune and carried it outward. The sound touched the stone walls and returned, creating gentle echoes that layered over the original melody. The effect was subtle but profound, as though the castle itself had decided to join in, to support this strange moment of tenderness in a place dedicated to darkness and power. Something began to shift in Alessandra. Not dramatically, not like a door slamming open, but like ice melting at winter's end, slowly, inexorably, one drop at a time. The burning in her eyes fluctuated. The terrible crimson glow didn't disappear, but it pulsed in rhythm with the melody, dimming slightly during the falling notes, brightening during the rise, as though her very essence was beginning to synchronize with the music. Memories stirred in the depths of her mind, breaking free from the locked vaults where she had buried them centuries ago. She remembered a summer evening impossibly long ago. She had been Alessandra Nocturne then too, but Nocturne had been her family name, not a title she had chosen to reflect her nature. She had been 17 years old, mortal, fully human, the youngest daughter of a minor noble house in a kingdom that no longer existed on any map. Her mother had been ill, and young Alessandra had sat by her bedside through the long night, holding her hand, listening to her labored breathing. To comfort her, to provide some distraction from pain and fear, her mother had hummed this song, this exact melody. A tune her own mother had sung to her, and her mother before that, a chain of sound linking generation to generation. Young Alessandra had learned it without realizing, absorbing it through repetition and love, and she had hummed it back, creating a duet there in the darkness, two voices affirming that even in pain, even facing death, there was still connection, still comfort, still love. Her mother had died 3 days later. Within a month, the plague had taken her father and both her brothers. Elisandra had survived, alone, the last of her line. And when the stranger had come, beautiful and terrible and offering escape from grief through the dark gift of immortality, she had said yes. She had not thought of that lullaby in 300 years. The memory should have hurt. Should have ripped open old wounds and left her bleeding from losses that time could never truly heal. But somehow, filtered through Thomas's gentle humming, it didn't. The memory came wrapped in warmth rather than pain, bittersweet rather than bitter, an acknowledgement of what had been lost but also what had once been real. Her breathing, which had been coming in desperate pants, began to slow. The trembling that had racked her body for days eased by subtle degrees. Her fangs, still pressed against Thomas's throat, relaxed their pressure infinitesimally. Not withdrawing, not yet, but no longer demanding immediate satisfaction. The hunger remained. It would always remain, the price of her immortal nature. But for the first time in weeks, it was not the only thing she felt. Thomas continued to hum, and now she could hear the nuances in his voice. He wasn't a trained singer. There were rough edges, places where his voice cracked slightly or wavered. But there was authenticity in those imperfections, a humanity that was more affecting than any polished performance could have been. He sang the way someone sings when they think no one is listening, or when the only listener is someone they care for deeply. The watchers in the shadows began to emerge slightly, drawn by the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Lord Vesper's ancient eyes were wide with something that might have been hope. Lady Morgana, who had been Elissandra's companion since the early days of her reign, pressed a hand to her mouth. Whether in shock or suppressed emotion, it was impossible to say. Even the youngest members of the court, fledglings who had never known human life, seemed affected by the melody, swaying slightly as though pulled by invisible threads. Elissandra's grip on Thomas loosened fractionally. Her arms, which had held him with desperate, crushing intensity, relaxed enough that he could have pulled away if he'd chosen to. He didn't. He remained in her embrace, a voluntary anchor, solid and warm and inexplicably, impossibly safe. Where? Her voice was a ragged whisper against his skin. Where did you learn that song? Thomas didn't stop humming immediately. He brought the melody to a natural resting point, the final notes hanging in the air like the last light of sunset before he answered. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but clear. My grandmother taught it to me. She sang it when I was a boy, when I couldn't sleep because of nightmares. She said it was very old, older than memory, a song that mothers had sung to frighten children since the beginning of time. He paused, and Elisandra felt him take a careful breath. When the summoning came, when I felt the pull to come here, I didn't know what I could possibly offer a being as powerful as yourself. I'm not strong or particularly brave. I have no magic, no weapons. Just myself. But I thought, everyone, no matter how old or how powerful, was once someone's child. And every child at some point needed comfort. The simple logic of it struck Elisandra like a physical blow. She had been so consumed by her nature as a predator, by her identity as a queen and a monster, that she had forgotten the layers beneath. Forgotten that before she was the Crimson Sovereign, before she was a vampire, before she was even Elisandra Nocturne of the noble house, she had been a little girl who loved her mother and laughed at butterflies and hummed lullabies in the dark. A sound escaped her then, something she had not made in centuries. A sob. Dry and painful, torn from a chest that no longer needed air, from a heart that no longer beat, but a sob nonetheless. And then another, and suddenly the vampire queen was weeping in the arms of a human stranger, her body shaking with the force of emotions she had thought herself incapable of feeling. Thomas's response was immediate and instinctive. He held her closer, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, fingers threading through her midnight hair. He didn't speak, didn't try to offer false comfort or meaningless platitudes. He simply held her and began to hum again, the same simple melody, steady as a heartbeat, constant as the tide. The crimson glow in Elissandra's eyes flickered wildly, brightening and dimming like a candle in the wind. Tears tracked down her porcelain cheeks, and where they fell upon Thomas's shirt, they left small dark stains. Whether tears could be shed by the undead was a question philosophers and scholars had debated for centuries. Tonight, the answer was being written in salt and sorrow on simple linen. The hunger, that terrible, all-consuming need, began to transform. It didn't disappear. That would have been impossible, as fundamental to her nature as breathing was to his. But it changed character, shifting from a desperate, violent craving to something deeper and more profound. Not just the need to consume but the need to connect. Not just to take warmth but to share it. Not just to remember life but to honor it. Her fangs finally withdrew from his throat. Slowly, reluctantly, like a sleeper waking from a dream, she pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her face was a ruin of smeared tears and desperate emotion, her carefully maintained regal composure utterly shattered. She looked young suddenly despite the centuries weighing upon her soul. Young and lost and terribly, heartbreakingly vulnerable. "I almost killed you," she whispered. "I wanted to. The hunger is still there." "How did you know? How could you possibly know that this would work?" Thomas met her gaze with those calm, earth-brown eyes. "I didn't know. Not for certain. But I've seen desperate need before, Your Majesty. In sick children during harsh winters, in soldiers after battles, in people pushed beyond what they thought they could endure. And I've learned that sometimes the thing we need most isn't what we think we need. Sometimes what breaks the fever isn't medicine but a cool hand on the forehead. Sometimes what ends the nightmare isn't waking but a gentle song reminding us that morning will come. You compared me to a sick child." There was no anger in her voice, only a kind of wondering amusement, as though she were discovering something about herself she had never suspected. "In that moment, weren't you?" He asked it without judgment, a simple question seeking understanding. "Not because you're weak or less than what you are, but because need doesn't respect power. Pain doesn't care about crowns. And loneliness," he paused and something sad flickered in his eyes. "Loneliness is perhaps the greatest leveler of all. It makes beggars of kings and children of the ancient." Elisandra stared at him and slowly, something fundamental shifted in her expression. The desperation that had defined her features for days began to recede, replaced by something more complex. Curiosity perhaps. Interest. And underneath it all, the first fragile stirrings of something that might, given time and care, become trust. She became aware suddenly of their position. They stood in the center of her throne room, wrapped in each other's arms with an intimacy that should have been reserved for lovers, witnessed by her entire court. Her gown was rumpled, her hair disheveled, her face tear-stained. She looked nothing like the cold, controlled sovereign who had ruled with absolute authority for 3 centuries. And yet, as she glanced around at her court, she saw no contempt in their eyes. No disgust or disappointment. Instead, she saw something that shocked her almost as much as the lullaby itself: relief. They had watched their queen descend into uncontrollable hunger, had seen her pride and her carefully maintained facade crumble, and they had feared, not for themselves but for her. Now, seeing her gentled, seeing her tears, they looked grateful. "Your Majesty," Lord Vesper said softly, stepping forward with careful deference. "The dawn approaches. Perhaps rest would be advisable? For both of you." The mention of dawn sent a tiny thrill of instinctive fear through Elisandra. Even ancient vampires respected the sun's power, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. The long, terrible night was ending. She had survived it. They had survived it. She looked back at Thomas, who still stood calmly in her loosened embrace, showing no sign of impatience or fear despite everything that had transpired. "You volunteered for this," she said slowly, still trying to understand. "The summoning ritual, it's binding. You cannot leave until the terms are fulfilled. You know this." "I know. And the traditional terms state that the human must remain until the vampire's need is satisfied. That could be days, weeks, longer." She searched his face for regret, for second thoughts. "You would give up your freedom, your life as you know it, for, what? A story? A noble sacrifice." "For the possibility of understanding," Thomas said, and there was quiet conviction in his voice. "For the chance that maybe, just maybe, the old stories aren't entirely true. that monsters might be made, not born. That even immortals might need kindness. He paused and a small wry smile touched his lips. And because my grandmother would have told me to help someone in need, regardless of whether they wore a crown or had fangs. Despite everything, the hunger still gnawing at her, the confusion and upheaval of the past hour, the tears still drying on her cheeks, Elisandra laughed. It was a small sound, rusty with disuse but genuine. Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. The past tense carried its own weight of loss, and she understood intimately what that meant. Come, she said, finally stepping back but taking his hand in hers. Her skin was cold against his warmth, but the contact was no longer desperate. It was almost companionable. If you're to stay, you should at least be comfortable. And she hesitated, suddenly uncertain in a way she hadn't been in decades. I would hear more of that song. If you're willing. Thomas squeezed her hand gently. I'm willing. As they moved toward the doorway that led to the private chambers of the castle, the vampire queen and the human who had volunteered to face her, the court watched in silence. The candles burned lower, their red light softening to amber as dawn approached. Through the Gothic windows, the very first hints of gray touched the eastern sky. And in the moment before they disappeared from sight, Elisandra Nocturne turned back to look at her people. Her eyes no longer burned with uncontrollable crimson fire. They glowed still with the inherent power of her nature, but the glow was banked now, controlled, more like embers than wildfire. This human is under my personal protection, she announced, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect for 3 centuries. Let any who would harm him answer to me. Then she was gone, leading Thomas deeper into the castle, into chambers that had never known human footsteps, leaving behind a court that buzzed with whispers and wonder at what they had witnessed. Lord Vesper stood for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. Then he turned to Lady Morgana, who stood beside him with an expression of mingled shock and hope on her ancient features. Do you think, she began, but he raised a hand. I think, he said slowly, that we have just witnessed something that has not occurred in a very long time. Perhaps since before our queen was turned. He paused, considering his words carefully. We have seen her remember her humanity. And that, dear Morgana, changes everything. In the east, the sun prepared to rise as it had every morning since the world began, indifferent to the dramas of immortals and mortals alike. But in the castle Nocturne, something new had been born, fragile as dawn light, uncertain as first spring flowers, but undeniably, impossibly real. Oh. The corridors of Castle Nocturne seemed to shift as Elisandra led Thomas deeper into its heart. What had appeared cold and menacing in the throne room gradually revealed layers of unexpected beauty. Tapestries lined the walls, their colors muted by age but still magnificent, depicting scenes from an era before vampires openly ruled these lands. Forests and festivals, harvests and holy days, all the warmth of mortal life preserved in thread and dye. Thomas noticed these details with the attention of someone who saw beauty in simple things. He paused before one particularly fine tapestry showing a village celebration, and Elisandra found herself stopping with him, watching as his eyes traced the woven figures dancing around a bonfire. This is lovely, he said softly. From before your time as queen? From before my time as anything but human, she corrected, her voice neutral but not cold. My mother commissioned it for my father's 40th year. I was 9. She tilted her head, studying the tapestry as though seeing it for the first time in decades. I had forgotten it was here. Strange how we stop seeing what surrounds us every day. They continued on, and Thomas was struck by the subtle transformation in his companion. The vampire queen who had held him with desperate, barely controlled violence was still present. He could see it in the careful precision of her movements, in the way her eyes occasionally flared with residual hunger, but she was no longer consumed by it. It was as though the lullaby had cracked something open inside her, allowing other parts of her nature to emerge. They climbed a spiral staircase, narrow and steep, clearly not meant for public access. Thomas's boots scraped against worn stone steps, while Elisandra moved in complete silence, her footfalls making no sound at all. The effect was disconcerting and she noticed his unease. "One of the less pleasant aspects of my condition," she said with a hint of dark humor. "We move quietly. Better for hunting." She glanced back at him and something complicated flickered across her face. "Does it bother you? Knowing what I am? What I was planning to do to you not an hour ago?" Thomas considered the question seriously as they climbed. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't afraid. But fear and understanding aren't mutually exclusive. You were in pain. You lashed out from that pain. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it comprehensible. Most humans would not be so philosophical about a vampire at their throat. Most humans didn't volunteer to be here." She had no answer for that, so they climbed in companionable silence until they reached a landing. Before them stood a door of dark wood, carved with intricate patterns of roses and thorns. Elisandra paused with her hand on the iron handle, and Thomas could see tension return to her shoulders. "These are my private chambers," she said quietly. "No one enters them uninvited. Not my counsel, not my servants, not even those I have taken as companions over the years." She turned to face him fully, and in the dim light of the corridor, her beauty was heartbreaking rather than terrible. "I brought you here because, I don't know, because the throne room is for the queen and right now I don't feel much like a queen. Because I haven't been alone with my thoughts for weeks, and the idea of being alone now feels unbearable. Because you sang to me and she trailed off, searching for words. "Because sometimes we need to be seen as ourselves, not as our titles," Thomas finished gently. "Yes." The word was barely a whisper. "Yes, exactly that." She opened the door, and they stepped into a space that defied every expectation Thomas had harbored about the dwelling of an immortal predator. The room was vast but not oppressive, circular, taking up the entire floor of one of the castle's towers. Windows lined the walls, tall and Gothic, but they were fitted with heavy shutters reinforced with steel, protection against the deadly sun. At night, as now, they stood open, allowing moonlight to spill across polished wooden floors covered with rich carpets in deep blues and silvers. But what struck Thomas most was the life in the room. Not literally, no plants could grow in a space that never saw sunlight, but the evidence of a mind that still engaged with beauty, with learning, with the world beyond hunger and darkness. Books. Everywhere books. Shelves lined every wall between the windows, climbing from floor to ceiling, packed with volumes of every size and age. Some were clearly ancient, bound in leather so old it had turned nearly black, their titles and languages Thomas didn't recognize. Others were newer, their spines bright with recent publication. He saw histories and philosophies, poetry and practical sciences, myths and maps and mathematical treatises. A writing desk stood near one window, its surface covered with papers, correspondence, and an elegant quill pen resting in an inkwell. Beside it, a globe showed the world as it had been 200 years ago, continents labeled in archaic script. The furniture spoke of comfort rather than grandeur. A large bed dominated one area, its frame carved from dark wood, its coverings deep crimson silk. Near the hearth, currently cold as vampires had no need of warmth, stood two chairs upholstered in midnight blue, positioned as though for conversation. A small table between them held a crystal decanter of what was almost certainly blood, dark and thick, alongside a single glass. And on every available surface, scattered like snow, were papers covered in elegant handwriting. Notes, it seemed. Observations and thoughts, poetry and ponderings, the internal landscape of a mind that had 3 centuries to fill and had chosen to fill them with words. "You're staring," Elisandra said, and there was a note of defensiveness in her voice. "I am," Thomas admitted, "but not in judgment. I'm trying to reconcile what I see here with what I knew or thought I knew about vampires." "And what did you know?" She moved to the decanter, poured a small amount of blood into the glass with practiced ease, then seemed to think better of it and set the glass down without drinking. "The stories paint you as monsters. Seducers and killers, creatures of pure appetite with no thought beyond the next victim." He moved slowly into the room, his eyes still taking in details. "But this," he gestured around them, "this is the room of a scholar. A thinker. Someone who reads and writes and tries to understand the world." Elisandra sat in one of the chairs by the hearth, and the gesture was so unexpectedly human. The way she curled into the seat, drawing her legs up beneath her gown, making herself smaller, that Thomas felt something tight in his chest ease. The monster from the throne room was gone, at least for now. In her place was a woman, ancient and inhuman, yes, but recognizably a person. "The stories aren't wrong," she said, staring at the cold hearth. "We are monsters. We do kill. The hunger is real and constant and cannot be ignored forever. But," she picked at a loose thread on the chair's arm, "but monsters can read. Killers can think. And predators can remember that they were once prey to greater forces themselves: time, death, fate." Thomas took the other chair, moving slowly so as not to startle her. Now that they were seated, facing each other like ordinary people having an ordinary conversation, the full strangeness of the situation struck him. An hour ago he had been certain he would die. Now he sat in comfortable silence with a creature who could kill him with casual ease, and felt, not safe exactly but not in immediate danger. "Tell me about the summoning," Elisandra said suddenly. "What did it feel like? How did you know to come?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, remembering. 3 days ago I was in my workshop. I'm a carpenter by trade, nothing fancy. I make furniture, repair buildings, honest work with my hands." He held up those hands, calloused and scarred, for her inspection. "I was planing a board for a table when I felt something. Like someone calling my name, but not with a voice. More like a pull here." He touched his chest, over his heart. "An urgency that grew stronger with each hour." "And you followed it? Just like that?" "Not immediately," he admitted. "At first I tried to ignore it, thought perhaps I was falling ill. But the pull grew stronger, and with it came impressions. Feelings that weren't my own. Hunger, yes, but also loneliness. Desperation. And underneath it all, something that felt like a question. Or a plea." Alisandra's eyes widened slightly. "You felt that? My emotional state. Is that unusual?" "The summoning ritual is old magic, older than my line, older perhaps than vampires themselves. It's meant to call prey, yes, but also to call possibility. To bring someone who can provide what the summoner truly needs." She leaned forward, intensity returning to her features. "But the summoned shouldn't be able to feel the summoner's emotions. That implies a connection deeper than mere ritual." "It implies what?" Thomas prompted when she fell silent. "Resonance," she said quietly. "The old texts speak of it. When a soul calls out in true need, sometimes it finds an answer in another soul that understands. That carries compatible pain, compatible loneliness. It's rare. I've lived 300 years and never experienced it." They sat with that revelation, the implications too large to fully grasp in the moment. Outside, the sky was definitely growing lighter now, the deep black of night fading to charcoal gray. Elisandra rose abruptly and moved to one of the windows, looking out at her domain. Thomas could see tension returning to her frame, the way her hands gripped the windowsill with white-knuckled force. "The sun rises soon," she said, her voice tight. "I'll need to close the shutters. And you should rest. There's food in the adjoining chamber, human food. Water. Whatever you need." "And you?" Thomas asked, standing as well but keeping his distance. "What do you need?" She laughed, but it was a broken sound. "You know what I need. The hunger hasn't gone away, Thomas. It's merely quieter. Your lullaby, your presence, it bought me time. Bought me clarity. But the sun will set again, and when it does, the hunger will return. It always returns. Then we'll face it when it comes." She turned to stare at him. You speak as though you intend to stay. I'm bound by the summoning, aren't I? You said I couldn't leave until your need was satisfied. I could release you." The words came out rushed, almost desperate. "The summoner has that power. I could speak the words right now and you'd be free to go back to your workshop, your ordinary life. You could forget this ever happened." Thomas moved closer, careful but deliberate, until he stood beside her at the window. Together they looked out at the lightening sky, at the forests and fields that surrounded Castle Nocturne, at the world preparing to wake while the undead prepared to sleep. "I don't think I could forget," he said honestly. "And I'm not certain I want to." Your Majesty. Elisandra, she interrupted. Here in this room just Elisandra. Titles are weights and I'm tired of carrying them. Elisandra, he repeated, tasting the name. I came here because something called to me, yes. But I stayed, I walked through those doors into your throne room, because I chose to. And I'm choosing to stay now. Not because of magic or binding, but because he struggled to find words for something he barely understood himself. Because I heard the pain under the hunger. Because your desperation felt familiar. Because every person, no matter how powerful or how changed, deserves someone to sit with them in the dark. She was crying again, silently this time, crystalline tears tracking down her porcelain cheeks. You don't know what you're offering. The hunger will demand feeding. Eventually I will need blood. Fresh blood. And you're here, warm and alive, and it would be so easy to. Then take it. The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread and spread. Elisandra stared at him in shock. What? Not now, Thomas clarified, his voice steady despite the fear he couldn't quite hide. Not when you're out of control, not when it's driven by desperation. But if you need blood to survive and I'm here and I'm willing, then take what you need. With permission. With understanding. Not as predator and prey but as, he paused, searching for the right word. As companions facing a difficult reality together. That's insane. But her voice held wonder alongside horror. No human volunteers to be fed upon. The few who do are broken. Seeking oblivion or obsessed with death. You're neither of those things. No, he agreed. But I am someone who understands chronic need. My sister had a wasting sickness when we were children. Every day she needed help to eat, to move, to do the simplest things. And every day our family provided that help without resentment, because we loved her and because need doesn't make someone less valuable. She died when I was 15, and I learned then that sometimes love means acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Means providing for needs that never stop demanding attention. Elisandra reached out with one pale hand and touched his face, a feather-light contact as though confirming he was real. You compare yourself to family. To love. But we barely know each other. Then perhaps we should change that. Thomas covered her cold hand with his warm one, not pulling it away but holding it against his cheek. The sun rises. You need to rest. But when night falls again, maybe we could talk? Learn about each other? Not queen and subject, not vampire and human, just two people who find themselves in an unusual situation and would like to understand it better. A smile touched Alisandra's lips, genuine and almost shy. I would like that. Very much. She stepped back and her bearing shifted subtly. Not the desperate creature from the throne room, but not quite the regal queen either. Something in between, something still finding its balance. There's a chamber through that door. It was meant for a lady-in-waiting, back when I thought I might maintain such pretenses. It's comfortable. Safe. The door locks from the inside if you wish. I trust you, Thomas said simply. That may be the most dangerous thing you've said all night. But she smiled as she said it, and for a moment she looked almost happy. Sleep well, Thomas Ashwood. When you wake there will be food. And when I wake, she paused, considering. When I wake, I hope to be better company than I was at our first meeting. You were memorable, I'll give you that. She laughed, a real laugh this time, bright and clear. Then she sobered, her eyes meeting his with intensity. Thank you. For the song. For your understanding. For not running when any sane person would have fled. I don't know what this is, what's happening between us, but thank you. Thomas bowed slightly, a gesture of respect between equals. Until nightfall then. As he moved toward the door she had indicated, Elisandra turned to begin closing the heavy shutters against the coming dawn. But she paused with her hand on the first one and spoke again, her voice so soft he almost missed it. My mother used to sing that lullaby. Before everything changed. I had forgotten how it sounded. How it made me feel safe. She looked back at him, silhouetted against the growing light. You gave me back a piece of myself I thought lost forever. That's a debt I cannot repay. It's not a debt, Thomas replied gently. It's a gift. And gifts don't require repayment. Only appreciation. Then he was through the door, leaving her alone in her chambers as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose that she could see but never again feel. Elisandra closed the shutters one by one, sealing herself into familiar darkness. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the darkness didn't feel oppressive. It felt like possibility. She moved to her bed, lay down upon silk sheets that held no warmth, and closed her eyes against the day. Sleep would claim her soon. The sun enforced rest on her kind with absolute authority. But before unconsciousness took her, she hummed, very softly, for notes rising and three falling, a melody of comfort and memory and unexpected hope. In the chamber beyond, Thomas Ashwood lay in a bed far more comfortable than his simple cottage could provide and stared at the ceiling. His heart still raced with residual adrenaline, his mind spinning through everything that had happened. He had volunteered for this, yes, but the reality proved far more complex than he had imagined. Yet beneath the fear and confusion he felt something else. A sense of rightness, as though he had found his way to a place he was meant to be, however unlikely that seemed. The Vampire Queen's need had called to him across miles, and he had answered not because he was suicidal or brave, but because loneliness recognized loneliness and pain understood pain. He thought of his grandmother, of the lullaby she had taught him, of her weathered hands and gentle wisdom. She had believed that kindness was never wasted, that compassion could bridge any divide. He had always thought that naive, a pleasant fiction to make the harsh world seem more bearable. Perhaps he had been wrong. As sleep finally claimed him, the last thing he heard was a sound from beyond the wall. Faint, barely audible but unmistakable. Humming. The Vampire Queen was humming his grandmother's lullaby as she surrendered to daylight sleep. Aunt Thomas smiled in the darkness, and knew with certainty that he had made the right choice. When consciousness returned to Elisandra, it came gently, an unfamiliar sensation. Typically, the sunset pulled her from day sleep with harsh urgency, her body responding to the disappearance of the sun's threat with the readiness of a warrior expecting ambush. But this evening, waking felt like rising through warm water, surfacing into awareness rather than being jerked into it. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory of herself with the practiced attention of someone who had learned to monitor her condition closely. The hunger was there, always there, a low background hum that would never truly silence. But it was manageable. Controlled. Nothing like the desperate clawing need that had consumed her for weeks. The memory of the previous night washed over her in waves. The throne room. The desperate violence she had barely contained. Thomas's calm presence. The lullaby that had cracked something open inside her that she had thought sealed forever. Thomas. The human who had volunteered. Who was still here, somewhere in her private chambers, unless the previous night had been some fever dream born of desperation. Elisandra rose from her bed with preternatural fluidity and moved to her mirror, one of the few she kept, as her kind could see their reflections despite popular myth. The face that looked back at her was her own, unchanged by day sleep, but somehow different. The crimson glow in her eyes had receded to a faint luminescence, present but not overwhelming. Her features, while still pale and sharp, seemed softer somehow, as though the tension that had defined them for weeks had finally eased. She took more care with her appearance than usual, selecting a gown of deep blue velvet that brought out the remaining warmth in her skin, arranging her dark hair so it fell in loose waves over her shoulders rather than the severe style she typically favored. As she worked, she caught herself and paused, examining her own behavior with the detached interest of a scholar studying a curious phenomenon. She was preparing herself for company. For him. The realization was both amusing and unsettling. When was the last time she had cared about her appearance for someone else's benefit? Decades? Longer? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Your Majesty? Lord Vesper's voice, cautious and concerned. You are well? She opened the door to find her chancellor standing in the corridor, and the relief that flooded his ancient features when he saw her was almost comical. I am well, Vesper. Better than I have been in some time. He studied her with the frankness of old friendship. You look different, more yourself. The human's presence truly helped then? His name is Thomas, Elisandra said, and there was a note of something protective in her voice. And yes, he helped. In ways I'm still trying to understand. He is awake and has been fed. Lady Morgana took the liberty of providing him with fresh clothing as well. His own garments were rather rumpled. Vesper's tone was carefully neutral, but there was a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. He asked after you. Wanted to ensure you had rested well. The fact that a human in the castle of vampires would concern himself with her well-being struck Elisandra as absurd and touching in equal measure. Where is he now? The library. He found his way there some hours ago and has been examining your collection with the enthusiasm of a child in a sweet shop. Quite the reader, apparently. Of course he would be drawn to the library. Elisandra felt a smile tug at her lips. I'll find him there then. In the meantime, send word to the court. I will hold audience tomorrow night. There are matters of state I've neglected during my indisposition. Your Majesty, are you certain you're ready? I am certain that I have duties and I've shirked them long enough. She softened her tone, seeing his concern. I'm not fully recovered, Vesper. The hunger remains and will need to be addressed. But I'm functional again. I'm myself again, more or less. That will have to be enough. After Vesper departed, Elisandra made her way through the castle corridors toward the Grand Library. It occupied the entire west wing, 3 stories of books collected over centuries, and was one of the few places in the castle where she felt truly at peace. Knowledge didn't judge. Books didn't care whether the hands turning their pages were warm or cold, living or undead. She found Thomas exactly where Vesper had indicated, standing before one of the tall windows with a book in his hands, so absorbed that he didn't hear her approach. The clothing Morgana had provided him suited him well. Simple but well-made, dark trousers and a white shirt with a gray vest, the kind of attire a prosperous merchant might wear. His hair was damp, suggesting he had bathed, and in the evening light filtering through the window, he looked almost ethereal himself. Elisandra paused in the doorway, allowing herself a moment to simply observe him. He stood in a shaft of moonlight, reading with complete focus, occasionally turning a page with careful fingers. There was something deeply peaceful about his presence, a centeredness that had nothing to do with power or control and everything to do with being comfortable in his own skin. Was attractive. Not in the way prey was attractive to a predator, though she would be lying if she claimed some of that wasn't present. But attractive in the way a well-crafted piece of furniture was attractive, or a perfectly structured argument. He fit into this space, this library, this castle as though he belonged here. The thought should have disturbed her. Instead it felt right. Find anything interesting? She asked and watched him startle slightly before turning with a smile. Elisandra. Her name and his voice sounded like music. I hope you don't mind me making free of your library. The selection is extraordinary. She moved into the room, approaching him with the careful grace that was second nature. I don't mind at all. What have you found? He held up the book, a treatise on agricultural practices from 2 centuries prior. This probably seems dull, but I find the evolution of farming techniques fascinating. The way knowledge builds on itself, how each generation improves on what came before. He set the book down on a nearby table. Though I suspect you didn't come here to discuss crop rotation. No, she admitted. I came to see if you were real. If last night actually happened or if I imagined the whole thing in the depths of hunger madness. It happened. Thomas's expression grew serious. All of it. The desperation, the hunger, the lullaby. The conversation after. All real. They stood facing each other across the library's reading table, and the air between them felt charged with possibility and uncertainty. Elisandra found herself uncharacteristically at a loss for words. She had ruled for centuries, commanded armies, negotiated with kingdoms. But this simple interaction with a human carpenter left her feeling exposed and uncertain. I meant what I said, Thomas continued quietly. About staying. About helping if I can. I don't fully understand what's happening between us, but I don't think I need to understand it completely to know it matters. You spoke of feeding, Elisandra said, forcing herself to confront the practical reality. Of allowing me to take blood from you. Do you still mean that? I do. But not today, I think. You seem calmer. More in control. I am. Your presence, your song, it bought me time. But time always runs out for my kind. Eventually, the hunger will demand satisfaction. She moved to the window, looking out at her dark domain. I've been thinking about what you said. About taking what I need with permission, with understanding. It's such a foreign concept to me. We hunt or we're given criminals, prey that has already been judged and condemned. The idea of taking blood as a gift, freely given, she trailed off, shaking her head. It changes the dynamic entirely, Thomas said, moving to stand beside her. Not too close. He was learning her boundaries, respecting the space she needed. It makes it a transaction between equals rather than predator and prey. But we aren't equals. Elisandra turned to face him. I could kill you without effort. Could compel you with a glance if I wished. The power imbalance is absolute. Physical power, yes. But there are other kinds of power. Thomas met her gaze steadily. You need something I can provide. That gives me leverage, doesn't it? Not to manipulate or control, but to establish terms. Boundaries. Mutual respect. The concept was so novel, so utterly outside her experience, that Elisandra found herself genuinely considering it. You would establish boundaries? With me? If we're to do this, whatever this is, then yes. I think we need to. Thomas moved to sit at the reading table, gesturing for her to join him. After a moment's hesitation, she did. You're right that you could compel me, could take what you wanted by force. But you haven't. You could have killed me last night when you were at your most desperate, but you didn't. That tells me you have more control than you give yourself credit for. Or that I was too weak to follow through. Is that what you believe? Elisandra considered the question honestly. No, she admitted. I was desperate, yes, but there was a moment, right before you started humming, when I felt myself pulling back. Some part of me, buried deep, was still fighting to maintain control. Your song gave that part of me the strength to win. Then we build on that. Thomas leaned forward, his expression earnest. We establish rules. Times when feeding is acceptable and times when it isn't. Amounts that are safe versus dangerous. Ways to communicate need before it becomes desperate. We treat this like any other chronic condition that requires management. You make it sound so simple. I don't think it's simple at all, Thomas corrected. But complicated doesn't mean impossible. It just means we need to be thoughtful. Intentional. Elisandra stared at him, this extraordinary ordinary human who had walked into her castle and somehow, impossibly, made her 300-year existence feel manageable. Why? She asked again, the question that had haunted her since his arrival. Why are you doing this? And don't tell me it's because of the summoning or your grandmother's lessons. There's something more. Something personal. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully tended. I told you about my sister. About her illness. What I didn't say was that toward the end she was in constant pain. She needed help with everything and she hated it. Hated being a burden, hated being dependent. One night when I was sitting with her, she asked me why I stayed. Why I didn't just let the servants care for her. Why I spent every evening reading to her or helping her eat when I could have been living my own life. He paused, his hands clenched on the table. I told her it was because I loved her, which was true. But there was more to it. I stayed because bearing witness to someone's suffering, being present for them in their darkest moments, is one of the most important things a person can do. It doesn't fix the suffering. It doesn't make the pain go away. But it means they don't face it alone. And that matters. It matters more than almost anything. Elisandra felt something twist in her chest, in the place where her heart once beat. She was fortunate to have you. She didn't think so. Not at first. She fought me, pushed me away, insisted she didn't need help. But eventually she accepted it. Let me be there for her. And in her final days, she told me that knowing someone cared enough to stay, to witness her suffering without flinching, gave her courage. Made the unbearable slightly more bearable. And you see me as your sister? Elisandra wasn't sure whether to be moved or insulted. No, Thomas's gaze returned to her, brown eyes warm and steady. I see you as someone suffering in a way others refuse to acknowledge. You're supposed to be a monster, so no one asks if you're in pain. You're immortal, so no one considers whether eternity might be a burden rather than a gift. You're powerful, so weakness isn't permitted. But pain doesn't care about any of that. And I think you've been in pain for a very long time. The accuracy of his assessment stole her breath. She had never articulated it even to herself, but he was right. The hunger was only the surface manifestation of a deeper ache. The loneliness of immortality. The weight of centuries. The slow erosion of humanity, piece by piece, until she sometimes wondered if anything real remained beneath the crown and the fangs. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I have been. Thomas reached across the table, slowly enough that she could pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. His warmth against her cold skin should have triggered her hunger, but instead, it felt grounding, anchoring her to something real and present. Then let me help, he said simply. Not because you're weak or because I'm particularly noble, but because everyone deserves someone who sees their pain and doesn't look away. Even vampire queens. Maybe especially vampire queens. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the library table, an immortal predator and a mortal craftsman finding unexpected common ground in acknowledged suffering and the tentative promise of mutual care. Finally, Elisandra squeezed his hand gently and released it, sitting back in her chair. If we're to do this, establish boundaries and manage the hunger together, then you need to understand more about my nature. What I am, how I function, what triggers the desperate states you witnessed last night. I'd like that, Thomas said. Understanding seems like a good place to start. So she told him. Not the romanticized version from stories, but the clinical reality of vampire existence. She explained how the hunger built gradually over time, manageable for weeks or even months, but always accumulating interest like an unpaid debt. How certain triggers, emotional stress, physical exertion, proximity to fresh blood, could accelerate the process. How elder vampires like herself could go longer between feedings than fledglings, but when they finally needed blood, they needed it more desperately. She described the hierarchy of feeding. Criminals and the condemned at the bottom, freely given blood from willing donors next, and at the top, blood taken with violence from the unwilling, which was both the most satisfying and the most corrosive to whatever remained of vampire morality. The problem, she explained, is that I've relied primarily on criminals for 3 centuries. It was the compromise I made with myself. I would feed, but only on those society had already condemned. It maintained some moral framework, some sense that I wasn't simply a monster. But, Thomas prompted, hearing the unspoken caveat. But there haven't been enough criminals lately. My territory has been peaceful, well-governed. Crime has dropped significantly. She laughed without humor. I became a victim of my own success. The better I ruled, the fewer acceptable prey were available. And I was too proud to admit I needed an alternative arrangement. So the hunger built until you couldn't control it anymore. Exactly. And when I finally acknowledged I needed help, the old magic responded to my desperation and brought you. She studied him curiously. Except you're clearly not a criminal. So why did the summoning ritual choose you? Maybe, Thomas said slowly, because I wasn't meant to be prey at all. Maybe the magic recognized that you needed something other than just blood. The implication hung between them, vast and profound. That her deepest need wasn't for sustenance but for connection. Not for prey but for partnership. Not for a victim but for someone who saw her fully, monster and woman, queen and creature, powerful and desperately vulnerable, and chose to stay anyway. That's a terrifying thought, Elisandra admitted. Why terrifying? Because blood is simple. Straightforward. You take it, the hunger eases, the transaction is complete. Connection is, she struggled for words. Messy. Complicated. It requires trust, which I haven't truly given anyone in decades. It requires vulnerability, which is the antithesis of survival for my kind. And it requires hope, which is perhaps most dangerous of all. Hope that what? Thomas asked gently. Hope that I might be more than what I've become. That 300 years of compromises and slow moral erosion haven't completely destroyed whoever Elisandra Nocturne was before she chose immortality over death. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Hope that I might still be capable of caring about someone other than myself. That I might still be, in some small way, human. Thomas rose from his seat and moved around the table. For a moment, Elisandra tensed, instincts warring with conscious thought. But he simply knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, and looked at her with such profound understanding that she felt tears threatening again. You hummed my grandmother's lullaby as you fell asleep today, he said softly. Lady Morgana told me. She heard it through the wall and was shocked because apparently you never sing or hum. You haven't made music in anyone's memory. Elisandra hadn't realized anyone had heard. The revelation made her feel exposed, but Thomas's gentle tone eased the discomfort. You remembered that song because it connected to your mother, to your human childhood, to love and safety and comfort, he continued. That's not the action of someone who's lost their humanity. That's the action of someone who's buried it deep but never let it die completely. One song doesn't make me human. No, he agreed. But it's evidence. A start. And starts are what matter when you're trying to find your way back to something you thought you'd lost forever. Before she could respond, a soft chime echoed through the library, the castle's warning that someone approached. Elisandra rose smoothly, her bearing shifting back to regal authority so quickly that Thomas was momentarily disoriented by the transformation. The vulnerable woman discussing humanity was gone, replaced by the Crimson Sovereign in an instant. Lady Morgana appeared in the doorway, bowing deeply. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. There's a matter that requires your attention. One of the border patrols has returned with news from the Southern Territories. Elisandra glanced at Thomas, something almost apologetic in her expression. Duty calls. We can continue this conversation later? Of course. I'll be here. Reading about crop rotation and contemplating the nature of existence. His slight smile took any sting from the words. As Elisandra moved to follow Morgana, she paused in the doorway and looked back. Thomas? Thank you. For understanding. For not running. For everything. Until later then, he replied and watched her disappear into the corridor, the blue velvet of her gown flowing behind her like water. Alone in the library, Thomas returned to his book, but his mind was miles away from agricultural practices. He had volunteered for this expecting to face a monster. Instead, he had found something far more complex. A person trapped in a monstrous existence, fighting daily to retain scraps of humanity while burdened with needs that couldn't be denied or ignored. He thought of his grandmother, of her lessons about kindness and compassion. She had always maintained that everyone, no matter how far they'd fallen or how terrible their circumstances, deserved to be seen as fully human. Or in this case as fully person. He had no illusions about the challenges ahead. The hunger would return probably soon. There would be moments of danger, times when Elisandra's control might slip. The inherent power imbalance between them couldn't be wished away, no matter how many boundaries they established. But he had also seen her tears, heard her desperation, witnessed the moment when a simple lullaby cracked open the fortress she had built around her heart. And he had felt, in that moment of connection, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest courage wasn't in fighting monsters. It was in recognizing that monsters might be people who had lost their way, and choosing to walk beside them as they tried to find it again. Outside the library windows, night deepened over Castle Nocturne. Stars emerged in patterns that had wheeled overhead for millennia, indifferent to the small dramas of immortals and mortals below. But within the castle walls, something new was taking shape, as fragile and precious as the first green shoots of spring. Understanding. Connection. And perhaps, given time and care, something that might eventually resemble redemption. 3 nights passed in a rhythm that surprised them both with its ease. Thomas spent his days exploring the castle and its extensive library, reading voraciously and occasionally venturing into the gardens, carefully maintained by mortal servants who came and went but never stayed past sunset. Elisandra attended to the accumulated business of her realm, meeting with her council, reviewing reports, and gradually reasserting the controlled authority that had defined her reign before the hunger had overwhelmed her. But the evenings, those belonged to them alone. They fell into a pattern of meeting in the library after Alessandra's administrative duties concluded. Sometimes they talked, conversations ranging from philosophy to practical matters of agriculture and craftsmanship. Thomas taught her about woodworking techniques, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional from raw materials, and she found herself fascinated by the way his hands moved as he described his craft. Confident, capable, expressing care through precision. Other times, they simply sat in companionable silence, reading in adjacent chairs, the quiet punctuated only by turning pages and the occasional comment about an interesting passage. It was, Alessandra reflected, the most peaceful she had felt in decades. But peace was not resolution. The hunger remained, and they both knew that eventually, it would demand acknowledgement. On the fourth evening, Alessandra felt the familiar tightening begin. Not the desperate madness from before, but a definite intensification. Her senses sharpened, becoming hyper-aware of Thomas's presence. His heartbeat, his breathing, the warmth radiating from his skin. Her fangs ached, and the crimson glow in her eyes brightened perceptibly. Thomas noticed immediately. They had been discussing a particularly dense philosophical treatise, but mid-sentence, he stopped and looked at her directly. "It's getting worse again, isn't it?" She appreciated his directness, even as shame heated her cold cheeks. "Yes. Not unmanageable yet, but building. Another few days, perhaps a week, and I'll be back where I started. Then we shouldn't wait." Thomas closed his book and set it aside with decisive calm. "We talked about boundaries and establishing terms. I think it's time we acted on that." Alessandra's immediate instinct was to refuse, to insist she could manage longer, that he shouldn't have to subject himself to something so intimate and dangerous. But she had learned enough about him to know that he had already thought this through, had made the decision with full awareness of the risks. "You're certain?" she asked quietly. "I'm certain. But I have conditions." This surprised her. "Conditions? You said we should establish boundaries. I've been thinking about what those should be." Thomas stood and moved to face her directly, his expression serious but not afraid. "First, it happens here in this library, not in your private chambers. This is neutral ground, a place we both associate with learning and peace." Alessandra nodded slowly. "Reasonable. What else?" "Second, we establish a signal, a word I can say if it becomes too much, if I need you to stop. And you have to promise that you will stop, immediately, no matter how strong the hunger is." "A safe word," she said, recognizing the concept from human negotiations of intimate acts. The fact that he was applying it to feeding struck her as both practical and deeply thoughtful. "What word?" Thomas considered. "Daybreak. It's something that represents safety for me and, well, a natural stopping point for you." "Daybreak," she repeated. "I swear on my name and power that if you speak that word, I will stop, regardless of the cost to myself." "Third," Thomas continued, "we do this with you seated and me standing at least this first time. You said you're stronger than me, that you could easily overpower me. I need to feel like I can step back if necessary, even if rationally I know I probably couldn't get away." The psychological insight impressed her. He was managing his own fear by creating the illusion of escape, and he was self-aware enough to acknowledge that's what he was doing. "Agreed. Anything else?" "Just one more thing. Afterward we talk about it. What worked, what didn't, how it felt for both of us. We treat this as a learning experience, something we refine together." Alessandra felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not hunger, but gratitude. He was approaching this with such care, such consideration for both their needs. "You've thought about this thoroughly." "I've had 3 days to think about little else," Thomas admitted. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not scared. But fear managed is different from terror. And I'd rather face this consciously, with planning and mutual respect, than have it happen in a moment of crisis." "You are a remarkable man, Thomas Ashwood." "I'm a carpenter who talks too much and overthinks everything," he corrected, but he smiled. "So, do we do this now, or do you need time to prepare?" Alessandra took inventory of herself. The hunger pulsed steadily, not desperate but definitely present. Waiting would only make it worse, make control harder. And there was something to be said for acting while they were both calm and clear-headed. "Now," she decided. "If you're ready." Thomas nodded and moved one of the reading chairs into a shaft of moonlight from the window. Instinctively seeking illumination, she realized, wanting to see clearly what was happening. He sat, settling himself with visible effort to calm his breathing, and then looked up at her. "I'm ready." Elisandra approached slowly, giving him time to track her movement, to maintain the sense of control that was so important to him. As she drew close, she could hear his heartbeat accelerate, smell the fierce sweat that prickled at his hairline despite his outward calm. The scent triggered her hunger, made it surge, and she had to pause, closing her eyes and breathing deeply through her nose to center herself. "You're afraid," she observed. "That's wise. I'm dangerous right now. I know. But I trust that you're more than your hunger. That you can control it." His faith in her was humbling. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. "I won't betray that trust. I swear it." She moved closer, standing before his chair, and slowly, carefully, placed her hands on the armrests, bracketing him without touching. This close, his warmth enveloped her like summer sun, and the hunger roared its approval. Her fangs extended fully, aching with need, and the crimson glow of her eyes painted his face in shades of blood. Thomas's breath quickened, but he didn't look away. "Tell me what you're going to do." "I'm going to place my hand on your shoulder for stability," she said quietly, suiting action to words, her cool palm settling on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Then I'll lean in and bite here." She touched a spot on the right side of his neck where the artery ran close to the surface. "You'll feel a sharp pain at first, but I'll release a venom that will dull it quickly, make it almost pleasant. The danger is that the venom also creates euphoria, makes you less aware of blood loss. So I need you to stay focused. If you feel dizzy, lightheaded, if anything feels wrong, you say the word. Understand?" "Daybreak," Thomas confirmed. "If I need you to stop." "Exactly." She paused, studying his face. "Last chance to change your mind." "I haven't changed my mind." "Do what you need to do, Elisandra." The sound of her name in his voice, steady despite his fear, gave her courage. She leaned in slowly, allowing him to track her movement, and pressed herself against him, not with the desperate crushing force of their first encounter, but with careful control. One hand on his shoulder, the other braced against the back of the chair. Her face lowered to his neck and she inhaled deeply, drawing in his scent. And then she bit. Thomas inhaled sharply at the initial pain, his hands gripping the armrests. But within seconds the venom took effect and she felt his body relax. The first pull of blood against her tongue was ecstasy. Warm, rich, vital, everything her cold body craved. The taste of him was unique. Each human had their own flavor profile, she had learned over centuries, his carrying notes of the forest and earth, clean and honest and wholly satisfying. The hunger that had been building for days eased immediately, like a clenched fist slowly opening. She drank carefully, monitoring his heartbeat and breathing, taking what she needed but no more. The act was intimate beyond description, life flowing from one person to another, but it was also functional, necessary, a transaction made sacred by its mutual agreement. After what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes, time seemed elastic in such moments. She felt the hunger recede to manageable levels and immediately began to withdraw. But Thomas's hand came up to the back of her head, not pushing but holding her in place for just a moment longer. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice dreamy with the effects of the venom. "I can give a little more." The offering, freely made, nearly broke her control. But she had promised to honor his boundaries, which meant she had to honor her own as well. She withdrew carefully, licking the wound to seal it, another property of vampire saliva that aided in preventing their prey from bleeding out. She stepped back, putting space between them, and watched as Thomas blinked slowly, his pupils dilated, a slight smile on his face. The venom's euphoric effects would fade quickly, but for now he looked almost drunk. "That was," he paused, searching for words, "not what I expected." "In good ways or bad?" Elisandra asked, taking another step back to give him more space. "Good. Strange but good. Intimate." His hand came up to touch the healing wound on his neck. "Does it always feel like that?" The venom affects everyone similarly. Most find it pleasant, which is how we're able to hunt successfully. Prey often doesn't fight once the bite happens. She moved to lean against the desk, keeping distance between them. How do you feel? Dizzy? Weak? Thomas took inventory of himself with the careful attention she was learning was characteristic of him. A little lightheaded but not bad. Like I've stood up too quickly. Nothing concerning. Good. I took less than a pint, enough to ease the hunger for several days, but not enough to cause significant weakness. You'll be tired tomorrow, should rest and eat plenty of red meat to help rebuild what you've lost. But there shouldn't be lasting effects. They were both silent for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then Thomas spoke, his voice serious despite the lingering venom effects. How was it for you? Did it help? The question demonstrated such care, such consideration for her experience, that Elisandra felt something shift in her chest. Yes. The hunger is much quieter now. Controlled. I feel, she paused, searching for the right words. I feel like myself again. Clear-headed. Thank you. You don't need to thank me. This was an agreement, remember? Mutual benefit. Perhaps. But I still appreciate what you've given me. What you've trusted me with. She moved closer again, but slowly, non-threateningly. May I check the wound? Make sure it's healing properly? Thomas tilted his head, exposing his neck in a gesture of trust that made her throat tight. She examined the bite marks carefully, 2 small punctures, already closing, minimal bruising. Her saliva had done its work well. Without thinking, she placed her hand against his cheek, a gesture of comfort and gratitude. He leaned into the touch, his eyes closing briefly. This is strange, he murmured. I should be traumatized. I just let a vampire drink my blood. But I feel peaceful. Connected. The venom, she began, but he shook his head. It's not just the venom. It's knowing that we did this together with respect and care. That you kept your promises. That I could trust you and that trust was honored. Elisandra withdrew her hand and sat in the chair adjacent to his, suddenly needing to be at his level rather than looming over him. In 300 years I have never fed like that. Always it was hunting, taking, asserting dominance over prey that fought or ran. Or it was criminals who submitted because they had no choice. But this, mutual agreement, freely given, boundaries respected, this is entirely new to me. How does it compare? Thomas asked, genuinely curious despite his post-feeding languor. She considered the question carefully. The blood itself is no different. Hunger is satisfied either way. But everything around the act is different. There's no guilt, no sense that I've taken something stolen. No need to assert dominance or prove my power. Instead, she struggled to articulate something she had never felt before. There's gratitude, respect, a sense of obligation to honor what you've given me. It's humanizing in a way I didn't expect. Humanizing, Thomas repeated softly. You say that like it's surprising. It is. I've spent centuries trying to be a good ruler to my people, a fair queen, an ethical predator if such a thing can exist. But I've never felt particularly human. That died the night I was turned. Or so I thought. Maybe humanity isn't about what you are but how you treat others. How you choose to exist in the world. The simplicity of the statement belied its profound implications. Elisandra had spent 3 centuries defining herself by what she had become: vampire, predator, undead sovereign. It had never occurred to her that she might retain humanity through her actions rather than her nature. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the experience from their respective perspectives. Finally, Thomas spoke again. So, we established some boundaries and they worked. What happens now? Now? Elisandra smiled, genuine and warm. Now we continue. I can probably go 4 or 5 days before the hunger builds significantly again. When it does, we repeat this, refine what works, adjust what doesn't. Over time we'll develop a rhythm. A sustainable pattern. And between feedings? What do we do? Whatever we wish. She gestured around the library. You're welcome to continue exploring the castle, the grounds, the library. If you'd like to work, I understand skilled hands grow restless without purpose. There's a workshop in the lower levels that hasn't been used in decades. Tools, wood, everything you'd need. Thomas's eyes lit up at the mention of a workshop. Truly? I'd love that. My hands do get restless. Then it's yours to use as you see fit. She paused, then added carefully, and in the evenings, if you're willing, I would enjoy continuing our conversations. It's been refreshing to talk with someone who sees me as a person rather than just a queen or a monster. I'd like that very much, Thomas said warmly. Then, with a slight smile, though I should probably eat something before the lightheadedness gets worse. Lady Morgana mentioned something about iron-rich foods. Elisandra stood, offering her hand to help him up. He took it without hesitation, and she carefully pulled him to his feet, monitoring to make sure he was steady. Come. We'll get you fed, and I'll show you to the workshop tomorrow evening. For now, you need rest and sustenance. As they left the library together, walking side by side through the moonlit corridors, Elisandra marveled at the strangeness of the situation. 4 days ago, she had been on the verge of madness, consumed by hunger she couldn't control. Now, she walked beside a human who had seen her at her worst and chosen to stay. Who had given his blood freely and established boundaries that honored them both. Who had, somehow, made the unbearable burden of her existence feel manageable. At the door to his chambers, Thomas paused. Elisandra? Thank you for keeping your promises. For being controlled enough to stop when you needed to. I know it wasn't easy. Easier than you might think, she admitted. Knowing that you trusted me made me want to be worthy of that trust. It's a strange motivation for a vampire, but effective nonetheless. He smiled and took her hand briefly, squeezing it in farewell. Until tomorrow evening, then. Until tomorrow. As his door closed behind him, Elisandra stood in the corridor for a long moment, her hand still tingling from his touch. The castle around her, which had felt like a prison during her desperate weeks of hunger, now felt different. Not quite like home. She wasn't sure she'd ever felt truly at home here, but like a place where something important was happening. Where change was possible, even for an immortal who had thought herself beyond changing. She made her way back to her own chambers and stood at the window looking out at the night. Her realm stretched before her, peaceful under starlight, the forests and fields she had protected for centuries. She had built her reign on careful control, on being the ethical monster, on proving that vampires could be more than mindless predators. But until Thomas had arrived, she had never considered that being more than a monster might mean allowing herself to need someone. To accept help. To build something like partnership with a human rather than simply ruling over them. It was terrifying. It was hope. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow night. The days that followed established a rhythm that neither Elisandra nor Thomas had anticipated but both came to cherish. Thomas spent his mornings and afternoons in the workshop Elisandra had shown him, a spacious room in the castle's lower levels, dust-covered but equipped with tools that, while old, were of exceptional quality. He cleaned and sharpened them, set up a proper workspace, and began crafting pieces that served no immediate purpose beyond the joy of creation. A jewelry box with intricate inlay work. A set of bookends carved with forest motifs. A small table with legs that curved like water frozen in motion. Lady Morgana and Lord Vesper would occasionally visit him during daylight hours, curious about this human who had so affected their queen. They found him refreshingly unpretentious, willing to discuss everything from philosophy to the proper seasoning of venison stew. Gradually, the castle's residents began to regard Thomas not as prey or even as a peculiar pet, but as a person, a distinction that surprised all of them. The evenings belonged to Elisandra and Thomas together. Sometimes in the library, sometimes in the castle's various rooms, once even in the gardens under moonlight, where Thomas taught her to identify trees by bark texture since she could no longer see them in sunlight. They talked endlessly, about history, about humanity, about the peculiar isolation of immortality and the equally peculiar limits of mortal life. Every 4 or 5 days, when Elisandra felt the hunger building, they enacted their careful ritual. She would inform him directly, no dancing around the subject. They would meet in the library. The feeding would proceed with full awareness and respect for the boundaries they had established. And afterward, they would talk about the experience, gradually refining the process until it felt less like a transaction and more like a strange but comfortable intimacy. One evening, nearly 3 weeks into Thomas's residence at Castle Nocturne, they sat in the library as usual. Thomas had been reading a collection of poetry from a century prior, occasionally reading passages aloud, while Elisandra worked on correspondence, her hand moving with preternatural speed across parchment as she addressed various administrative concerns. "Listen to this," Thomas said and read. "In darkness dwells not only fear, but possibility unbound. For sight deceived by light so clear, may find in shadow truth profound." He looked up. "Do you think that's true? That darkness reveals truth rather than hiding it?" Elisandra set down her quill, considering. "Poetic sentiment aside, I think darkness is simply different. Not better or worse than light, just different. It reveals some things while obscuring others, just as light does." She paused. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've been thinking about my time here. About you. When I first arrived, I thought I understood the situation. Dangerous vampire queen, desperate human volunteer, clear power dynamic. Simple darkness, if you will, with a monster lurking in it. And now?" She kept her voice neutral, but her attention was fully focused on him. "Now I realize it was never that simple. You're not a monster, or if you are, you're a monster who writes poetry and runs an effective bureaucracy and agonizes over the ethics of feeding. And I'm not a victim, or if I am, I'm a victim who has more freedom here than I did in my village, where everyone knew me as Thomas the carpenter whose whole family died tragically, and treated me with careful pity." He set the book aside and met her gaze directly. "What I mean is, the darkness here, literal and metaphorical, hasn't hidden truth. It's revealed complexity, nuance, the possibility that two very different beings might find understanding despite everything that should make it impossible." Elisandra felt something warm and sharp pierce through her chest. "You're saying you don't regret coming here?" "I'm saying I'm glad I came. That whatever led me here, magic or fate or random chance, I'm grateful for it." Before she could respond, the door to the library burst open with enough force to slam it against the wall. Lord Vesper stood in the doorway, his usually calm demeanor shattered, his ancient face twisted with distress. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but there's an emergency. The southern border, we're under attack." Elisandra was on her feet instantly, every trace of the contemplative woman gone, replaced by the warrior queen. "Details. Now." A group of vampire hunters, at least 20 strong, heavily armed with silver and holy water. "They've already killed 2 of our border guards and are advancing toward the outlying villages. They're being led by—" He paused, pain flashing across his features. "By someone who knows our territory well. Someone who can anticipate our defenses." "A traitor?" Alisandra's voice could have frozen blood. "It appears so, Your Majesty." Thomas had stood as well, stepping back to give them space but clearly processing the information. "How long until they reach populated areas?" Vesper glanced at him, momentarily surprised that a human would involve himself before answering. 2 hours, perhaps 3 if they move cautiously." Elisandra was already moving toward the door, her mind clearly racing through tactical considerations. "Mobilize the guard. Full defensive positions around the villages. I want our fastest scouts tracking the hunters' movements. And find me whoever betrayed us. I will personally—" "Your Majesty." Thomas's voice cut through her commands, quiet but firm. "Take me with you." She turned to stare at him. "Absolutely not. This is combat. You're human and untrained in warfare. You'd be killed within minutes." "Probably," he agreed. "But think about it. These are vampire hunters. They're expecting vampires. They're armed to kill your kind. But a human, someone who could potentially talk to them, negotiate, maybe even de-escalate, that's something they won't anticipate. Out of the question." Alisandra's tone was final. "I won't risk you like that." "It's not your risk to decide," Thomas said, his voice remaining calm but taking on an edge of steel. "I'm not your subject, remember? I'm here by choice and I can choose to help." They stood facing each other, the air between them charged with sudden tension. Vesper watched nervously, clearly uncertain whether to intervene in what was rapidly becoming an argument between equals. "If you die," Elisandra said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "if they kill you because you walked into a battle trying to negotiate, I will never forgive myself. And if your people die because there was a chance at peace that nobody took, how will you feel?" Thomas countered. "You told me you spent 3 centuries trying to be an ethical ruler. Doesn't ethics demand trying every option before violence? These are vampire hunters. They don't want to negotiate. They want us dead." "Maybe. But what if they're wrong about you? What if they're operating on old stories and assumptions, the same way I was before I came here?" Thomas moved closer, his expression earnest. "What if someone could show them that the Crimson Sovereign isn't the monster they think she is?" "I am a monster," Elisandra said flatly. "Don't romanticize what I am because we found an arrangement that works." "You're a person who happens to be a vampire," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference." The argument was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Lady Morgana appeared, half dragging, half carrying a wounded vampire, one of the border guards, by his uniform. His left arm was badly burned, the unmistakable mark of holy water, and he was bleeding from multiple wounds. "Your Majesty," he gasped as Morgana lowered him carefully to the floor. "The hunters, they have something. A weapon. It's not silver or holy water. It's—" he convulsed, crying out in pain. "It burns like sunlight. Concentrated sunlight. They're using it too." Another spasm cut off his words. Elisandra knelt beside him, her face a mask of controlled fury. "How many have they killed with this weapon?" 3. 4. I don't know. We're falling back, but they're pushing hard. They want to reach the castle before dawn. They want to trap me here," Elisandra said, understanding flashing across her features. "Attack at night, drive us back to the castle, then at dawn when I'm weakest, when I have to retreat from the sun, they assault the castle itself." She looked up at Vesper. "Clever. Someone has taught them our tactics very well indeed." Thomas knelt on the wounded vampire's other side, his face grave. "A weapon that mimics sunlight. That's not standard vampire hunter equipment. That's something new. Something dangerous. Which is exactly why you shouldn't come," Elisandra said, turning her attention back to him. "This isn't the time for negotiation. This is survival." "Your Majesty," the wounded guard gasped, grabbing her wrist with his good hand. "The humans in the border village. The mortal families who live there. The hunters are driving them ahead, using them as shields. If we attack to defend ourselves, we risk killing innocents." Alisandra's expression cracked, showing the anguish beneath the tactical facade. Her rule had been built on protecting all her subjects, vampire and human alike. The villages within her territory paid taxes and in return received protection and fair governance. The humans living there had chosen to remain under vampire rule because life was safer and more prosperous than in the surrounding kingdoms. "They're using your own ethics against you," Thomas said quietly. "They know you won't attack if it means killing innocents. So they've made it impossible for you to defend yourself without compromising everything you've built." Elisandra stood, her movements sharp with barely contained violence. "Then we need to find another way. Vesper, I want—" "Let me go ahead," Thomas interrupted. "Alone. Before you and your forces arrive." Everyone turned to stare at him. "Hear me out," he continued quickly. "I'm human. I'm not a vampire's thrall. Anyone with basic magical sense could confirm that. I'm just a carpenter from a northern village who happens to be staying at your castle. I can approach them human to human and buy you time. Maybe I can get them to release the hostages. Maybe I can slow their advance. At minimum, I can learn more about this sunlight weapon and who's leading them. And at maximum, they could kill you on sight for fraternizing with vampires," Elisandra said harshly. "Have you considered that?" "Of course I have. But I've also considered what happens if we do nothing. Your people die. Innocent villagers die. And you're forced into a position where you either compromise your ethics or lose territory, maybe lose everything you've built." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "You asked me once why I volunteered. This is why. Not just to feed you but to help. Let me help." The silence stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring. Finally Lord Vesper spoke, his voice careful. Your Majesty, strategically speaking, the idea has merit. A human negotiator buys us time to evacuate civilians and establish better defensive positions. And if the hunters are operating on assumptions about vampires, seeing a free human vouching for your rule might complicate their narrative. Or get him killed, Elisandra said bitterly. But Thomas could see her mind working, considering possibilities, weighing outcomes. She had not survived 3 centuries by being inflexible. Give me 1 hour, Thomas said. If I can't make progress in an hour, you come in with full force and do what you must. But give me the chance to try. Elisandra closed her eyes and for a moment she looked truly pained. When she opened them, they glowed with crimson intensity, but there was something else there too. Fear. Not for herself but for him. If you die doing this, she said slowly, I will personally hunt down every member of that group and ensure they regret ever hearing the name Nocturne. Do you understand me? I do. And you still want to go? I do. She stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas could see the internal struggle playing across her features. Finally she nodded once, sharp and decisive. Morgana, get him a horse. One of the gentle ones, he's not a trained rider. Vesper, brief him on the terrain and the last known position of the hunters. Thomas? She crossed to him in 2 quick strides and gripped his shoulders. Come back. That's an order. Not your subject, remember? He smiled slightly, trying to ease the tension. Then consider it a request from someone who, she paused, seeming to struggle with words. From someone who has found your company valuable and would greatly regret its absence. It was perhaps the most open emotional statement she had made, and Thomas felt its weight. He covered her hands with his own, squeezing gently. I'll do everything I can to return. I promise. 20 minutes later, Thomas found himself on horseback for only the 3rd time in his life, cantering toward what was quite possibly his death. Lady Morgana had given him quick instruction in basic riding, and the horse, a gentle mare named Moonfall, seemed to sense his inexperience and compensated with steady, measured movements. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead. In other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Instead, Thomas's mind raced with possibilities, trying to construct approaches and arguments that might convince vampire hunters not to attack. He thought about the past 3 weeks, about the strange companionship he had built with Elisandra, about feeding sessions that had become almost meditative in their careful ritual, about conversations in the library ranging from profound to pleasantly mundane, about the way she smiled when something genuinely amused her, a real smile so different from the courtly expressions she wore like armor. He thought about her pain, about the loneliness of immortality, about the constant struggle to be more than what her nature demanded. And he thought about how many other vampires in her realm might be similar, people trapped in monstrous forms trying to find ethical ways to exist. If he died tonight, that would be sad. But if he could prevent a slaughter on both sides, if he could prove that understanding was possible even between humans and vampires, then maybe his grandmother's lessons about kindness and compassion would mean something beyond comfortable platitudes. He rode on through the darkness, toward uncertain confrontation, carrying hope as his only weapon. Behind him, at Castle Nocturne, Elisandra stood at the ramparts watching him disappear into the night. Her hands gripped the stone with force enough to crack it. Beside her, Vesper waited silently. I should not have let him go, she said quietly. Perhaps. But you did because he was right. Because ethics demanded it. Because you trusted him to make his own choice. Vesper paused. Because you care what happens to him. Elisandra didn't respond, but her expression was answer enough. She had spent 3 centuries carefully not caring, not allowing attachment, maintaining the distance necessary for a predator to rule over prey. But Thomas had somehow slipped past her defenses, not through manipulation or seduction, but through simple, honest care. If he died, a part of her would die with him. And she would rain such devastation upon his killers that the world would remember why the Crimson Sovereign was feared. But more than that, she would mourn. For the first time in 300 years, she would genuinely mourn a loss. Come back, she whispered to the night. Please come back. And in the darkness, stars looked down on a vampire learning to hope and a human riding toward danger for the sake of understanding. The outcome remained unwritten, balanced on the edge of a blade. Thomas reached the contested borderlands as the moon reached its zenith. The forest here was old and dense, the kind of wilderness that existed before humans had tamed most of the land. Ancient trees stretched overhead, their branches creating a canopy that turned moonlight into silver fragments scattered across the ground. In other circumstances, it would have been enchanting. Now it felt ominous. He had been riding for perhaps 30 minutes when he saw the first signs of conflict. Trees marked with burns, the scorching pattern of that sunlight weapon the wounded guard had described. Dark stains on fallen leaves that might be blood, vampire or human or both. And in the distance, flickering through the trees, the orange glow of torches. Thomas dismounted, tying Moonfall to a low branch. The mare nickered softly and he stroked her neck in reassurance. "Stay here, girl. If I don't come back by dawn, head home. They'll take care of you." He moved forward on foot, making no attempt to hide his presence. Stealth would be pointless. The hunters would have scouts and probably magical detection as well. Better to approach openly, showing he was unarmed and alone. The voices reached him first, harsh and argumentative. As he drew closer he could make out words. "Won't hold the position past dawn. We need to press the advantage now." And risk the hostages? The entire point was to force the vampires into an impossible choice. The point was to kill the Crimson Sovereign and free this territory from undead rule. Thomas stepped into the clearing where the voices originated, his hands visible and empty. "Hello. I'm here to talk." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Weapons swung toward him, crossbows loaded with silver bolts, swords that gleamed with holy water, and in the hands of two hunters, strange devices that hummed with barely contained energy. The sunlight weapons, he realized. There were perhaps 15 hunters visible in the clearing, though Thomas suspected more were positioned in the surrounding forest. They wore practical clothing in dark colors, leather armor reinforced at vital points, and various holy symbols hung around necks or pinned to shoulders. These were professional vampire hunters, not a mob of angry villagers. The man who spoke first was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a warrior's braid. His face was weathered and scarred, the look of someone who had fought hard battles and survived. A silver cross hung prominently on his chest. "Who in the hells are you?" he demanded. "My name is Thomas Ashwood. I'm a carpenter from the Northern Territories. And I'm currently a guest at Castle Nocturne." Thomas kept his voice calm and level, the tone he would use to discuss furniture orders with a difficult customer. "A thrall?" someone spat from the back. "He's been turned into one of their pets." "I'm not a thrall," Thomas said firmly. "I'm not under any compulsion or enchantment. I'm here of my own free will, and I'm here to prevent unnecessary bloodshed on both sides." The leader, Thomas pegged him as such by the way others deferred to him, studied Thomas with sharp eyes. Bold words for a man surrounded by vampire hunters. "Give me one reason we shouldn't kill you right now for collaborating with monsters. Because I can offer you something better than what you'll gain through violence." Thomas took a careful breath, choosing his words precisely. "You're here to destroy what you believe is a tyrannical vampire regime. But what if your information is wrong? What if the Crimson Sovereign is not the monster you think she is?" "Not a monster?" A woman pushed forward, her face twisted with grief and rage. "Those creatures killed my son. Drained him dry and left him in a ditch like garbage. Don't you dare tell me they're not monsters." Thomas felt the pain in her words, recognized it as genuine. "I'm sorry for your loss. Truly. Was it Queen Elissandra's people who killed him?" "It was a vampire," she shouted. "What difference does it make which one?" "All the difference," Thomas said quietly. "If a human murdered your son, would you hold every human equally guilty? Would you call for the extermination of all humanity? That's different. Is it? Or have you decided that vampires are inherently evil, incapable of ethics or choice, and therefore every vampire bears responsibility for the crimes of any vampire?" He looked around the clearing, meeting eyes one by one. "I'm not asking you to trust vampires. I'm asking you to consider that, like humans, they might be individuals. Some good, some bad, most somewhere in between. The leader raised a hand and the murmuring quieted. You say you're at Castle Nocturne by choice. What does that mean? Why would any free human choose to live among vampires? Here was the moment. Thomas could lie, could soften the truth, could present a version of events that made the hunters more sympathetic. But lies would crumble under scrutiny, and he had come here on a foundation of honesty. 3 weeks ago I responded to a summoning ritual, he said clearly. Queen Elisandra was experiencing an uncontrolled hunger that threatened her sanity. The old magic called for someone who could help. I volunteered. I went to Castle Nocturne knowing I might die. And let me guess, the leader said with heavy sarcasm. She revealed herself to be a misunderstood gentle soul, and you became friends? No, Thomas said. She nearly killed me. She was desperate and dangerous and barely in control. But I sang her a lullaby that my grandmother taught me, and it helped her remember her humanity. And since then I've stayed because I've seen what you refuse to believe, that even vampires can be more than their hunger. That they can struggle to be ethical. That they can build societies worth protecting. He pointed toward the forest behind him. Queen Elisandra rules this territory with more justice and fairness than most human kingdoms manage. Crime is low. Her subjects, human and vampire both, are safe and prosperous. She feeds only on criminals condemned by fair trial, and she's established laws that protect human rights. She's trying every day to be better than what her nature demands. Lies. The woman who had lost her son stepped forward, her hand on her sword. Propaganda to make us lower our guard. I've heard the stories about the Crimson Sovereign. The villages she destroyed. The people she slaughtered. Stories from 300 years ago, Thomas countered. From when she was newly turned and hadn't yet learned control. Yes, she did terrible things. She doesn't deny that. But she spent centuries trying to atone, trying to build something better. Do we allow no possibility of redemption? No chance for change? The leader held up a hand again, stopping the woman from advancing. He studied Thomas with an expression that was hard to read. You defend her passionately for someone who's known her mere weeks. Because in those weeks I've seen her struggle. I've watched her fight against her nature, maintain control when it would be easier to give in to violence. I fed her my own blood so she wouldn't have to hunt innocents. Thomas pulled aside his collar, showing the faint marks on his neck. These are from willing donation, not violent feeding. She treats me with respect, honors boundaries, and values my perspective even though I'm human and she could kill me without effort. Silence fell over the clearing. The hunters stared at the bite marks, and Thomas could see calculations running behind their eyes. A thrall wouldn't volunteer such information. Someone under compulsion wouldn't speak with such clear conviction. Finally, the leader spoke again. My name is Marcus Wainwright. I've been hunting vampires for 30 years. I've seen the devastation they cause. The lives they destroy. He paused, his expression grave. But I've also seen humans do equally terrible things, so I'm not blind to your point. The question is, what do you want from us? I want you to release the hostages you're using as shields. I want you to meet with Queen Elisandra under neutral conditions and discuss your grievances. And I want you to consider that maybe, just maybe, the world isn't as simple as monsters versus heroes. And if we refuse? If we continue our attack? Thomas met his gaze steadily. Then you'll fight vampires who are defending their home and their queen. You'll probably kill some of them with that sunlight weapon. But you'll also die because vampire warriors are formidable opponents. And the innocents caught in the middle, the human villagers you're using as shields, the vampire civilians who have done nothing wrong, they'll die too. Is that the outcome you want? Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to the woman who had lost her son. Katrina. You've been to the border villages. Tell me honestly, did the people there seem oppressed? Terrified? Katrina's face worked with conflicting emotions. No, she admitted reluctantly. They seemed content, prosperous even. But that doesn't mean. It means we should at least hear what the carpenter says before we commit to slaughter, Marcus interrupted. He looked back at Thomas. You say the queen will meet with us? Negotiate. I can't promise she will, Thomas said honestly. She's a proud woman and a protective ruler. You've killed several of her people. She may demand vengeance rather than negotiation. But I can promise I'll advocate for peace. And I can promise that if you release the hostages and agree to talk, she's more likely to listen. We release our leverage and walk into a vampire stronghold? That's suicide. Then meet in neutral ground. The old standing stones a mile north of here, they're on unclaimed territory. Bring whatever protection you think necessary. But come willing to talk, not just to fight. Marcus looked around at his people, reading their expressions. Thomas could see the internal debate playing out. They had come for violence, geared for battle. Peace was not what they had prepared for. I need to discuss this with my second, Marcus finally said. You'll wait here. He gestured to two hunters who moved to flank Thomas, not threatening but definitely guarding. Then Marcus and several others withdrew to the far side of the clearing, speaking in low, urgent tones. Katrina approached Thomas, her expression still hostile but slightly less murderous. My son's name was David. He was 17. He went into the forest one night and never came back. We found his body 3 days later. I'm sorry, Thomas said, meaning it. Was it in Queen Elisandra's territory? The border. Could have been hers, could have been unclaimed lands. Katrina's voice cracked. He was just a boy. He deserved a full life. He did, Thomas agreed. And whoever killed him, if they're under Queen Elisandra's rule and she learns their identity, she'll execute them. She doesn't tolerate murder of innocents. You believe that? I've seen her execute vampires for lesser crimes. She's harsh, Katrina. Maybe too harsh. But she's not unjust. They stood in uncomfortable silence until Marcus returned. His expression was carefully neutral, which Thomas took as a potentially good sign. Here's what we'll do, Marcus said. We'll release half the hostages now as a show of good faith. The others we'll bring to the standing stones. We'll meet there at first light. Gives us enough time to scout the position and prepare, but also puts vampires at a disadvantage since they're weakened by day. That won't work, Thomas said immediately. Queen Elisandra can't travel in daylight. The sun would kill her. Exactly. Which means we meet with her counsel while she remains safely in her castle, unable to threaten us directly. Thomas shook his head. If you want real negotiation, you need to meet with her directly. Which means dusk, not dawn. Dusk gives vampires full power. Yes. And choosing that anyway shows you're willing to trust her restraint. Shows you believe what I've said about her trying to be ethical. Thomas leaned forward slightly. You're asking for good faith. She's entitled to the same. Marcus's jaw worked as he considered this. Finally he nodded. Dusk tomorrow. The standing stones. She comes with no more than 5 guards. We'll have double that number, but no sunlight weapons deployed unless she proves hostile. I'll convey the terms. Thomas felt relief flood through him. It wasn't perfect, but it was a chance. A real chance at preventing slaughter. One more thing, Marcus added. You stay with us until the meeting. Insurance that this isn't a trap. Thomas had expected something like this. I understand. But I need to send word to Castle Nocturne about the meeting. Otherwise they'll assume I'm dead and attack. Write a message. We'll have it delivered by one of the released hostages. Thomas accepted parchment and ink from one of the hunters and carefully composed a message to Elisandra. He explained the terms of the negotiation, emphasized the genuine willingness of at least some hunters to consider peace, and added a personal note at the end. I'm unharmed and hopeful. Trust me and trust yourself. You can do this. As the hostage was released with the message, Thomas found himself sitting by the hunter's fire, surrounded by people who had been ready to kill him an hour before. The irony wasn't lost on him. You're either very brave or very foolish, Marcus said, settling beside him. My grandmother would say those are often the same thing, Thomas replied. The woman who taught you the lullaby? You heard about that? You mentioned it. That you sang to calm a raging vampire. Marcus shook his head in wonder. That's not in any hunter's manual. Because most hunters see vampires as monsters to be destroyed, not people in pain who might respond to kindness. Thomas poked at the fire with a stick. Don't misunderstand, I'm not saying all vampires are redeemable. Some are truly lost to bloodlust. But some, like Queen Elisandra, are trying desperately to retain their humanity. Shouldn't we honor that effort? 30 years, Marcus said quietly. 30 years hunting vampires, and you're the first person who's made me question whether I've been fighting the right fight. I don't think you've been fighting the wrong fight, Thomas said carefully. Evil vampires exist. They kill innocents. They need to be stopped. But maybe the fight should be more nuanced. Maybe it should be about stopping evil, not exterminating a species. They talked long into the night, Thomas and Marcus, trading stories and perspectives. Thomas learned about the hunter's life, the villages destroyed, the families torn apart, the genuine horrors committed by vampires without conscience. Marcus learned about Castle Nocturne, the careful rule of law, the protections for human citizens, the vampire who wept over her own monstrous nature and fought daily to be better. By the time pre-dawn gray touched the eastern sky, they hadn't resolved all their differences. But they had reached something more important: mutual respect. Understanding that both of them were trying, in their own ways, to make the world less dark. At Castle Nocturne, Elisandra received Thomas's message with mixed emotions. Relief that he lived. Anxiety about the proposed meeting. And something else, pride. Pride that this human carpenter had walked into a hostile situation and somehow created the possibility of peace. It's a trap, Lord Vesper said immediately. Your Majesty, you cannot seriously consider meeting with vampire hunters. I am seriously considering it, Elisandra said, reading Thomas's message for the third time. Because he's right. Ethics demand I try every option before resorting to violence. They'll use the sunlight weapons. They'll kill you. Perhaps. Or perhaps they're as tired of endless conflict as I am. She looked up at her council, gathered in her throne room in the pre-dawn darkness. How many vampires have we lost to hunters over the years? How many humans have died in retribution? This cycle of violence serves no one. Your Majesty, Lady Morgana spoke softly. You trust him? This human? Elisandra considered the question carefully. I trust that he believes what he's telling me. That he genuinely thinks peace is possible. Whether that belief is justified, she trailed off, then straightened, decision made. I will attend the meeting. Vesper, you and 4 others will accompany me. No aggressive positioning, but be ready to defend if necessary. Morgana, prepare medical supplies. If this goes wrong, we'll have wounded. And if it goes right? Morgana asked. Then perhaps, Elisandra said softly, we prove that Thomas's faith in both species is justified. The day passed slowly for Thomas, spent in the hunter's camp under watchful but not actively hostile supervision. He dozed fitfully, worried about the coming meeting. So much could go wrong. Elisandra could refuse to honor the terms. The hunters could attack despite their promises. Some vampire or human in either group could let fear or hatred override reason. But he had to believe it was possible. Had to believe that the understanding he and Elisandra had built over weeks could extend outward, could prove that the wall between species was not insurmountable. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, both groups prepared to travel to the standing stones. Thomas rode with the hunters, while messengers reported that vampire forces were moving into position as well. The stage was set. The standing stones stood in a cleared area of the forest, ancient megaliths placed by forgotten peoples for forgotten purposes. They formed a rough circle, each stone twice the height of a man, carved with symbols worn smooth by centuries of weather. The space felt sacred somehow, appropriate for what they were attempting. The hunters arrived first, taking positions around the perimeter. Thomas stood near the center with Marcus, both of them tense with anticipation. The hostages were bound loosely nearby. Marcus had agreed to release them as soon as the vampire delegation arrived, another show of good faith. As the last light faded from the sky and true darkness claimed the forest, movement stirred at the northern edge of the stone circle. Vampires emerged from the shadows with their characteristic silence, 5 guards surrounding a central figure. Elisandra Nocturne stepped into the circle and Thomas's breath caught. She had dressed for this meeting with deliberate care, a gown of deep purple that was neither aggressive nor submissive, jewelry that suggested wealth but not ostentation. Her hair was bound in an elaborate braid, her expression carefully neutral. She looked every inch a queen, powerful and controlled. But when her eyes found Thomas across the circle, he saw relief flash across her features, quickly suppressed. He was safe. That mattered to her, perhaps more than she wanted to admit. Marcus stepped forward. Your Majesty. Thank you for coming. Master Wainwright. Alessandra's voice was cool and professional. Your message suggested you wished to discuss terms. I'm listening. And there, in the gathering darkness, surrounded by ancient stones and watched by two groups of former enemies, the negotiation began. The negotiations were tense, difficult, and frequently on the verge of collapse. Marcus presented grievances, specific instances of vampire attacks on humans, demands for justice, calls for oversight. Alessandra countered with her own list: hunters who had killed vampire civilians, destruction of property, the assumption that all of her kind were guilty by nature. Thomas found himself in the unexpected position of mediator, translating not language but perspective. When Marcus spoke of monsters that must be controlled, Thomas rephrased it as concerns about public safety that require addressing. When Alessandra referred to ignorant human prejudice, he reframed it as historical trauma that has shaped current perceptions. It was exhausting, careful work, like walking a tightrope over an abyss. One wrong word could reignite hostilities. But gradually, painfully, progress emerged. The boy David, Alessandra said, several hours into the discussion. Katrina's son. I will investigate his death personally. If it was committed by one of mine, they will face execution. You have my word. Katrina, who had been sitting silently among the hunters, looked up with surprise. You would execute your own kind? For killing a human? I would execute my own kind for murder, Alessandra corrected. The species of the victim is irrelevant. Murder is murder, and in my territory, it carries a death sentence. How can we trust that? Marcus asked. How do we know you'll actually follow through? You can witness the investigation, Alessandra said. You can witness the trial if it comes to that. Transparency is not something I typically grant outsiders, but in this case, she glanced at Thomas. I've learned that trust must be earned through demonstration, not demanded through authority. Marcus nodded slowly. And in return you want? I want your people to stop treating all vampires as targets. To recognize that there are laws in my territory, and those who follow them should not be hunted like animals. Alessandra's voice carried steel. I want the sunlight weapons destroyed or surrendered. And I want a formal agreement. A treaty, if you will, that establishes rules of engagement. Clear criteria for what constitutes a legitimate target versus an innocent. You're asking us to distinguish between good and bad vampires. Marcus's tone was skeptical. That's not simple. It's exactly as simple as distinguishing between good and bad humans, Thomas interjected. You don't hold all humans responsible for the crimes of individuals. Extend the same courtesy to vampires. The discussion continued, moving from broad principles to specific terms. Thomas watched Alessandra carefully, noticing how she engaged with the negotiation. She didn't try to dominate or intimidate, didn't fall back on her power as queen. Instead, she listened, considered, and compromised where she could while holding firm on core principles. This was the woman he had come to know over weeks of conversation. Not the desperate creature from their first meeting, but the thoughtful ruler who agonized over ethics and tried every day to be better than her nature demanded. At one point, when the discussion stalled over the question of oversight, Alessandra surprised everyone by suggesting, what if we established a mixed council? Humans and vampires working together to adjudicate disputes and investigate crimes. Both species represented, neither holding absolute power. The proposal was radical enough that both sides fell silent. Marcus recovered first. That would require trust on a level that doesn't currently exist. Then we build it, Alessandra said simply. Slowly, carefully, with transparency and accountability. Or we continue the current cycle of violence and retribution, which serves no one. Thomas saw the moment when Marcus began to truly believe. Not in vampires as a whole, but in this particular vampire who was trying so hard to bridge an impossible divide. If we agree to this, Marcus said slowly, if we establish this council and commit to working together, you understand that it's a risk for both sides? That there will be those among both humans and vampires who see it as betrayal? I understand perfectly. Alessandra's gaze was steady. I'll face opposition from my own kind who believe humans are cattle, not partners. You'll face hunters who think I've seduced you into weakness. But the alternative is endless war. And I'm tired of war. The simple honesty of that statement, the weariness in her voice, seemed to affect the hunters more than any grand declaration could have. This wasn't a monster posturing. This was a person exhausted by centuries of conflict. By the time the moon reached its apex, they had the framework of an agreement. Specific terms would need to be worked out, but the core principles were established. Mutual recognition of sovereignty, joint investigation of disputed incidents, protections for civilians of both species, and the creation of a mixed oversight council. The hostages were released, tearful and grateful. The sunlight weapons were surrendered to Alessandra, who immediately had them destroyed. She wanted no temptation for either side to use such devastating tools. As the two groups prepared to depart, Marcus approached Alessandra directly. Your Majesty, I want you to know. I came here expecting a monster. I found a ruler trying to do right by her people. That doesn't erase 300 years of history, but it's a start. Alessandra inclined her head in acknowledgement. And I expected fanatics incapable of reason. I found people with legitimate grievances seeking justice. Perhaps we're both guilty of seeing what we expected rather than what was truly there. Perhaps. Marcus held out his hand, a human gesture of agreement. After a moment's hesitation, Alessandra took it. Her cold hand in his warm one, vampire and hunter shaking on terms of peace. Thomas watched from nearby and felt something tight in his chest ease. It wasn't perfect. There would be setbacks and difficulties. But they had proven something important. That understanding was possible, even across the deepest divides. As the hunters departed, Alessandra finally allowed herself to cross to Thomas. Her careful control slipped, and he saw exhaustion and relief war across her features. You did it, she said quietly. You walked into a hostile camp and somehow convinced them to talk instead of fight. We did it, Thomas corrected. I started the conversation, but you're the one who gave them reason to believe. Who showed them that change is possible. They stood close together in the shadow of the ancient stones, and for a moment, they were simply two people who had survived something harrowing together. When I received your message that you were being held by the hunters, that you were unharmed but wouldn't return until after the meeting, Alessandra's voice was rough. I imagined every possible way it could go wrong. Every outcome where you didn't come back. But I did come back. Thomas reached out and took her hand, that simple gesture of contact that had become familiar between them. I promised I would, and I keep my promises. You're a remarkable man, Thomas Ashwood. I'm a carpenter who got lucky and happened to have the right song at the right moment. He smiled. Everything else follows from that. They returned to Castle Nocturne as dawn approached, Alessandra and her guard moving with preternatural speed while Thomas rode Moonfall at a more sedate pace. The castle, which had been on war footing for the past day, gradually relaxed as word spread that peace had been achieved. In her private chambers, Alessandra stood at the window watching the sunrise she could see but never feel. Thomas had gone to rest in his own room, exhausted from 2 days of tension and negotiation. But before he had left, he had promised to join her the following evening to discuss what came next. What came next? Alessandra turned the phrase over in her mind. For so long, her existence had been about survival and control, about maintaining power and protecting territory. The future had been more of the same, an endless succession of identical nights stretching into infinity. But now things were different. There was the treaty to implement, the mixed council to establish. There would be resistance to overcome, prejudices to break down, trust to build slowly over months and years. And there was Thomas. The human who had volunteered, who had sung her grandmother's lullaby, who had walked into danger to prevent violence. The man who had shown her that even after 300 years she was still capable of change. She thought about his earlier words, about humanity being defined by actions rather than nature. She thought about the feeding sessions, about giving and receiving with respect. She thought about conversations in the library, about learning to see herself through his eyes. Not as a monster but as a person struggling to do right in difficult circumstances. The sun rose higher, and Elisandra retreated from the window, closing the heavy shutters. Day would claim her soon, pulling her into the enforced sleep of her kind. But as she lay down she found herself humming, 4 notes rising, 3 falling, a melody of comfort and memory. A lullaby that connected her to her mortal past. A song that reminded her she had once been someone's child, someone's daughter, someone who was loved simply for existing. Perhaps she could be that again in some form. Not mortal, never that. But human in the ways that mattered. Human in compassion and ethics. Human in the capacity to care, to change, to hope. Sleep took her gently, and for the first time in memory she did not dream of blood and darkness. She dreamed of a library full of books, of conversations with a carpenter, of moonlit gardens and the possibility of peace. When evening came, Thomas woke to find a note slipped under his door. Elisandra's elegant handwriting invited him to join her in the gardens after sunset. He washed, dressed, and made his way through the castle's familiar corridors with a sense of anticipation. He found her standing beside a fountain, the water sparkling in moonlight. She had changed from her formal negotiation attire to something simpler, a deep blue dress that made her look younger somehow, less regal and more like an ordinary woman enjoying an evening walk. "Thomas." She smiled, genuine and warm. "Thank you for coming." "Of course. Though I admit curiosity, why the gardens?" "Because I wanted to show you something." She led him deeper into the garden, to a section he hadn't explored before. Here the plantings were different, roses and night-blooming flowers, species that opened to moonlight rather than sun. "I started this section about 50 years ago. Flowers I could see at their best since I can't witness daylight blooms anymore. They're beautiful." Thomas breathed in the scent, rich and sweet. "They are. But they're also lonely." Elisandra touched a white rose gently. "Beautiful things experienced in isolation lose some of their beauty. I've been thinking about that since you arrived. About how much of my life I've experienced alone, by choice or necessity. And now?" Thomas asked quietly. "Now I'm considering the possibility that I don't have to be alone. That partnership might be possible, even for a vampire queen and a mortal man." She turned to face him fully. "The terms of the summoning have been fulfilled. Your presence restored my control, helped me through the worst of the hunger. You're free to go, Thomas. Free to return to your village, your workshop, your ordinary life." His heart sank, though he tried not to show it. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" "No," the word was firm, definite. "I want you to stay. But only if that's what you want too, freely chosen. Not because of magic or obligation but because you choose to be here. Choose to be," she hesitated, then continued. "Choose to be my friend. My companion. My partner in this strange new world we're trying to build." Thomas felt something warm bloom in his chest. "I choose to stay. Not because I have to, but because these past weeks have been the most meaningful of my life. Because I've found purpose here and friendship, and the sense that I'm part of something important. Even though I'm a vampire? Even though I'll outlive you by centuries? Even though there will always be danger, always be the hunger to manage? Even though," Thomas confirmed. He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Elisandra, you're not the monster you think you are. You're a person trying to do right in impossible circumstances. That's worth supporting. Worth being part of." She looked at him, and in her eyes, still faintly glowing with crimson but soft now, not burning, he saw vulnerability and hope in equal measure. "I've spent 300 years trying to be good enough. To prove I was more than my nature. But I always felt like I was failing, like the monster was winning. Then you arrived, and for the first time, someone saw me struggling and offered help instead of judgment. Because everyone deserves that," Thomas said gently. "Human or vampire, mortal or immortal. Everyone deserves someone who witnesses their struggle and says, "You're doing your best, and that matters." They stood together in the moonlit garden, two beings from different worlds finding common ground and shared understanding. In the distance, the castle rose dark and imposing, a monument to vampiric power. But here, among the flowers that bloomed for moonlight, they were simply two people choosing connection over isolation. "So what happens now?" Thomas asked. "We've established peace with the hunters, started building something new. What's the next step?" Elisandra smiled, and it was a real smile, unguarded and almost mischievous. Now we live. We work on implementing the treaty. We refine our feeding arrangement. We read books and discuss philosophy and argue about the proper technique for joining wood." She paused. "We prove day by day and night by night that understanding is possible. That bridges can be built. That even the longest night eventually gives way to dawn. Even for those who can't see the dawn? Especially for those." She squeezed his hands. "You've shown me that there are many kinds of light, Thomas. Not all of them require the sun." They walked through the gardens as the night deepened, talking of plans and possibilities. Tomorrow would bring challenges, resistance from both species, logistical complications, the ongoing work of building trust. But tonight they had peace, understanding, and the quiet comfort of knowing they weren't alone. Far above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent and eternal. In the castle, vampires went about their business, adapting to the new reality their queen had negotiated. In distant villages, humans spoke in wonder about the peace treaty, uncertain but hopeful. And in the moonlit garden, a vampire queen and a human carpenter walked side by side, proving through their simple companionship that the deepest divides could be bridged with honesty, compassion, and the willingness to see beyond what was to what might be. The vampire queen had been uncontrollable and intimate, driven to the edge of madness by hunger and isolation. But a lullaby had reminded her of her humanity. A carpenter had shown her that being seen fully, monster and woman, powerful and vulnerable, was not weakness but the foundation of genuine connection. And in learning those truths, she had found something more precious than any territory or treasure. Hope for a future where she might finally be free of the loneliness that had defined her immortal existence. The night was long, as all nights were in Castle Nocturne. But it was no longer dark in the way it had been before. Light came in many forms, moonlight and starlight, yes, but also the warm light of understanding, the gentle glow of compassion, and the steady flame of hope that refused to be extinguished. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. The mixed council met for the 8th time in the great hall of Castle Nocturne, a space that had been renovated specifically for this purpose. Gone were the intimidating shadows and blood-red candles that had once dominated the room. In their place, lanterns burned with steady golden light, and the long table at the center was crafted from warm oak, Thomas's work, a deliberate choice to symbolize the bridge between their worlds. 6 humans and 6 vampires sat around that table, reviewing cases and discussing matters of mutual concern. Marcus Wainwright occupied the seat of human co-chair, while Lord Vesper represented the vampire delegation. The meetings were still sometimes tense, still occasionally devolved into heated arguments, but they were happening. That alone was revolutionary. Elisandra observed from her throne, which had been repositioned to the side rather than at the head of the table. She had insisted on this arrangement. The council needed to function as equals, not as subjects reporting to a sovereign. Her role was to provide guidance when requested and to enforce decisions once made, but the deliberation itself belonged to the council members. Thomas sat among the human representatives, not as an official member but as an advisor. His unique position, trusted by both the Queen and the human communities, made him invaluable for translation and mediation. He was reviewing a report about a disputed land claim when he felt Alisandra's gaze on him and looked up, meeting her eyes across the room. She smiled, subtle and private, meant only for him. 6 months, and that smile still had the power to warm him. The meeting concluded with more agreements than disputes, which Marcus noted with satisfaction. "We're getting better at this," he remarked as the council members gathered their documents. First few meetings, I wasn't sure we'd make it through without bloodshed. Now we're actually solving problems. Progress, Vesper agreed, his tone dry but approving. Novel concept. As the hall emptied, Thomas made his way to Elisandra. She had descended from her throne and stood by one of the windows, looking out at the territory she had ruled alone for so long. "Penny for your thoughts," Thomas said, using one of the colloquial expressions he'd taught her. "I was thinking how strange it is," she replied, "to share power after 3 centuries of absolute authority, and how surprisingly comfortable it feels." "Control doesn't always mean strength," Thomas observed. "Sometimes strength means trusting others to help carry the weight." Wisdom from a carpenter. But she said it fondly, with affection rather than condescension. "Wisdom from my grandmother, actually. I'm just the messenger." They stood together in comfortable silence until Lady Morgana appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she was suppressing amusement. "Your Majesty, there are visitors. From the Southern Territories. They've heard about the treaty and wish to discuss similar arrangements for their regions." Alessandra's eyebrows rose. "More humans wanting to negotiate with vampires?" 3 delegations actually. 2 human, 1 from a vampire clan that's interested in adopting your model of governance. Morgana's composure cracked slightly, allowing a smile. "It seems word is spreading that the Crimson Sovereign has found a better way." "A better way," Elisandra repeated softly. She looked at Thomas. "Did you ever imagine, when you rode to answer a summoning 6 months ago, that it would lead to this?" "I imagined I might help one desperate vampire," Thomas admitted. "I never imagined it might help change the relationship between species." "Neither did I." She turned to Morgana. "Tell the delegations I'll meet with them tomorrow evening. And make accommodations. If they've traveled far, they'll need rest." After Morgana departed, Elisandra moved closer to Thomas, close enough that he could feel the perpetual cool of her skin, though it no longer seemed as cold as it once had. Perhaps he had simply grown accustomed. Or perhaps she had grown warmer. "The feeding," she said quietly. "It's been 4 days. I can feel the hunger building." This was their routine now, established over months of careful practice. Every 4 to 5 days, Thomas would voluntarily provide blood, and Elisandra would feed with the control and respect they had built together. It had become almost intimate in its familiarity, a private ritual that belonged to them alone. "Tonight?" Thomas asked. "If you're willing. I know you've had a long day with the council." "I'm willing." He always was. Not because he had to be, but because this act, this giving and receiving, had become one of the foundations of their relationship. Trust made physical. Care made tangible. They made their way to the library, their usual place for feeding. It had become their sanctuary, the room where they had first truly talked, where understanding had begun to grow. Thomas settled into his customary chair while Elisandra lit candles, more for ambience than necessity. Her eyes saw perfectly well in darkness. "I've been thinking," Thomas said as she approached, "about sustainability, about the future." "In what sense?" She positioned herself carefully, hands on the armrests, her face near his neck. The familiar pose but not yet touching. "I'm mortal, Elisandra. I'll age. Eventually I'll die. What happens then?" She pulled back slightly, her expression troubled. "I've been trying not to think about that. But we should think about it. Not morbidly but practically." Thomas reached up and gently touched her face, drawing her attention back to him. "I won't be here forever. But what we've built, this system of respectful feeding, the council, the treaty, that should outlive me. We need to teach others. Show them it's possible." "You want me to find other humans willing to provide blood voluntarily?" The idea clearly unsettled her. "Eventually, yes. Not to replace me while I'm here, but to expand the model. Imagine if every vampire in your territory had access to willing donors, people who understood the arrangement and consented freely. No more hunting, no more criminals as the only option. Just mutual agreement." Elisandra was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. That would require a massive shift in how both species think about feeding. Vampires would need to see humans as partners rather than prey. Humans would need to overcome their fear enough to trust us. It would take time, Thomas agreed. Probably decades. Maybe longer. But we've already proven it's possible, you and I. The question is whether we're willing to share that possibility with others. You're talking about your legacy, Elisandra said softly. What you'll leave behind when you're gone. I'm talking about our legacy. The change we could make together if we're brave enough. He smiled slightly. Besides, I'm not planning on dying anytime soon. I'm only 34. We have time. Time, she repeated, and something pained crossed her features. I have endless time. You have decades if you're fortunate. That disparity is something we can't change, Thomas finished gently. But we can make the time we have matter. We can build something that outlasts both of us. Well, that outlasts me anyway. She laughed despite herself, a sound that still surprised him with its warmth. Then she grew serious again, her crimson eyes meeting his brown ones. I've lived 300 years, Thomas. I've seen empires rise and fall. I've known hundreds of people, thousands perhaps. But I've never known anyone quite like you. Never had a partnership like this. The thought of losing it, of losing you. I know. You did know. He felt the same fear, the awareness that their time together was finite, precious because it was limited. But that's all the more reason to make it count. To use what we have to create something lasting. Elisandra leaned her forehead against his, a gesture of intimacy they had developed over months. Cool skin against warm, vampire and human, two beings finding comfort in connection. Very well, she said quietly. We'll develop the program. Carefully, slowly, with volunteers who understand fully what they're agreeing to. We'll prove that this model can work beyond just us. She pulled back enough to look him in the eyes. But for tonight, for now, this belongs to us. This moment. This moment, Thomas agreed. She bit then, the familiar sharp pain followed immediately by the venom's euphoric numbness. Thomas felt his blood flow into her, felt the subtle relaxation in her body as the hunger eased. It was intimate and strange and had become as natural to him as breathing. When she withdrew, she sealed the wound with her tongue and then, unexpectedly, kissed his forehead, a gesture of tenderness that had developed gradually over their months together. Thank you, she whispered. For your blood, yes, but more for your vision. For making me believe that the future could be different than the past. Thank you for being willing to change, Thomas replied. For being brave enough to try. They remained close for a moment longer, then Elisandra stepped back, giving him space to recover. Thomas touched the healing wound on his neck absently, already knowing it would be completely closed by morning. So, Elisandra said, moving to pour herself a glass of water for him, she had learned that he preferred it after feeding, something about resetting his system. Tomorrow we meet with delegations from other territories. Next week, the council reviews the new protection laws. And eventually, we develop a volunteer donor program that could revolutionize vampire-human relations. Busy schedule, Thomas observed, accepting the water gratefully. Indeed. Sometimes I wonder how I managed before you arrived, when my nights were filled with nothing but administrative duties and managing the hunger. You survived. You endured. That's what you do. Thomas finished the water and set the glass aside. But I like to think maybe now you're not just surviving. Maybe you're living. Living? Elisandra tested the word. Such a strange concept for the undead. And yet, yes. I think perhaps I am living for the first time in centuries. She moved to the window, looking out at the night that was her domain. We've accomplished something remarkable, Thomas. Not just the treaty or the council, but this, she gestured between them, this understanding, this friendship, this partnership, this love. Thomas said quietly. She turned sharply, surprise clear on her features. What? I love you, Thomas said simply. Not romantically, not in the way of lovers, though there's certainly affection. But I love you the way you love someone who has seen you at your worst and stayed anyway. Someone who challenges you to be better while accepting who you are. Someone who makes existence less lonely. Elisandra stared at him, and he saw her eyes brighten with moisture. Vampires could cry, he had learned. They did it rarely, but they could. I love you too, she said, her voice rough. In whatever form this takes, whatever we call it. You gave me back pieces of myself I thought lost forever. You showed me that change was possible. That I could be more than the sum of my hungers and mistakes. She paused, then added with a small smile, and you make excellent furniture. That table for the council is truly superb craftsmanship. Thomas laughed, the moment of emotional intensity breaking into something lighter. High praise from the Crimson Sovereign. I contain multitudes, she said with mock solemnity. I can appreciate both effective governance and well-joined wood. They talked late into the night, as they often did, about everything and nothing. About the delegations arriving tomorrow and the book Thomas was reading, and whether the roses in the garden would bloom more profusely with different soil amendments. Conversation flowing easily between weighty matters and trivial details, the comfortable discourse of people who knew each other deeply. Eventually, Thomas retired to his chambers, which had long since been relocated to a suite adjacent to Alessandra's personal rooms, a deliberate choice that had raised eyebrows among the court but which neither of them cared to explain. He slept soundly, dreamlessly, secure in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. Alessandra remained in the library reading by candlelight, but her mind was only partially on the text before her. She was thinking about Thomas's words, about legacy and the future. About the possibility that what they had built together might spread, might change the fundamental relationship between vampires and humans across territories. It was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so. But 6 months ago the idea of vampire-human cooperation had seemed impossible too, and yet the council functioned. The treaty held. Peace endured. If that was possible, what else might be? She thought about her 300 years of existence, about the long loneliness and the constant struggle to maintain her humanity against the pull of monstrous nature. She had survived, yes, but survival was not the same as living. Thomas had taught her the difference. A soft knock at the library door interrupted her thoughts. Lady Morgana entered, carrying a letter sealed with unfamiliar wax. This arrived by special courier, Morgana said. From the Western Kingdoms. It's addressed to you personally, but the courier said it concerns the carpenter who sings to vampires. Word has spread, Your Majesty. Far beyond our borders. Alessandra broke the seal and read quickly. Her expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to something that might have been awe. What is it? Morgana asked. It's from the Council of Elders in the Western Kingdoms, you know, the alliance of the oldest vampires in that region. They want to meet with Thomas and me. They say, she read from the letter, we have heard tales of the Crimson Sovereign who remembers her humanity and the human who gave freely what is usually taken by force. If these tales are true, if peace between our kinds is possible, then we must learn. The old ways of blood and darkness have sustained us, but perhaps it is time for a new way. Morgana's eyes widened. The Council of Elders. Your Majesty, their legends. Some of them are over 1,000 years old. If they're willing to consider change. Then what we've done here matters more than I realized, Alessandra finished. She set the letter down carefully as though it were something fragile and precious. Thomas spoke of legacy, of building something that outlasts us. I think perhaps we already have. Will you go? Meet with them? We will. Thomas and I together. Alessandra smiled, genuine and full of an emotion she hadn't felt in centuries. Pride. Not in herself alone, but in what they had accomplished together. After all, he's as much a part of this as I am. More perhaps. Without his willingness to see past the monster to the person, none of this would exist. After Morgana left, Alessandra returned to the window, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. Somewhere out there, Thomas slept peacefully. The council members, human and vampire both, rested in their respective homes, preparing for tomorrow's challenges. Delegations traveled through the night, drawn by the possibility of change. And in the Western Kingdoms, ancient vampires who had long since resigned themselves to existence as monsters read letters about a queen who had remembered her humanity and a human who had helped her find it again. The world was changing. Slowly, painfully, with setbacks and difficulties inevitable. But changing nonetheless. Alessandra began to hum very softly. 4 notes rising, 3 falling. A lullaby from her mortal childhood, taught to her by a mother 300 years dead, learned by a vampire queen from a carpenter, shared now with the night itself. A song of comfort and memory. A reminder that even the longest night eventually gave way to dawn. And that sometimes, the light you needed didn't come from the sun at all. It came from understanding, from connection, from the willingness to see and be seen fully. The vampire queen had been uncontrollable and intimate, driven to the edge by hunger and isolation. But a human had hummed a lullaby and everything had changed. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But truly, profoundly, and, with time and effort, perhaps lastingly. And in the end that was enough. That was everything. The night stretched on as nights do, full of darkness and starlight in equal measure. But it was no longer a night of loneliness and hunger. It was a night of hope.